Hi, my family. I included some of your lovely comments in this video and they really made me smile. The channel is going through a bit of a hard time, and I really need your support. Let's try to reach 1,000 likes and 1,000 comments. If everyone watching likes, leaves a comment and subscribes, we can do it together. Thank you so much. Let's get started. I was patrolling my usual forest trails at night. I've been a ranger for 8 years now, and nothing had ever scared me as much as this one experience that I encountered. Well, what I think was a Bigfoot, doing my routine patrol on this night. It all started with me walking along the same trail I do at night to do my rounds. Being Florida, it had rained earlier in the day, so everything was calm and peaceful, minus the puddles of mud here and there. The sun had set about an hour or two before, which meant it was exceptionally dark outside, although I was already used to this. The moon was barely out. I saw a few other rangers patrolling with me, but they had passed by and some were out of nowhere, maybe about 30 minutes later. I was walking along the dirt trail when I noticed something appeared in front of me. A dark, large figure, coming from the right side of the path and then crossing in front of me as it headed off into some thick brush off to my left. Palmettos, actually. This is directly where I patrol, meaning there should most definitely not be anything even remotely close to resembling whatever this thing was. Its speed is what surprised me and took me off guard, considering it didn't even give me enough time to turn around and see what it looked like. All I could make out was that it was jet black, very tall and easily taller than I was. It moved quickly. I didn't even have time to react until it had already gone into the bushes, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared deep in the palmettos. My heart sunk, and I felt an odd sensation. It was this incredible feeling of fear. All I can think about is how much more dangerous it had just made my job that night. If there was some large animal out here that moved fast, was taller than I and larger than I, that actually crossed paths with me like it did, what else might be lurking out here? Would it cross paths with me again? Was this thing actually looking for me? As I thought about it more, I considered the fact that if something was after me, then maybe whatever it was might be prepared to attack, although I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I began getting angry. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I was a few hours away from my shift ending and talking myself into returning to the station, telling myself that if I did, I would be safe. If this thing is out there, it's just as much looking for me as it is anybody else. So now more than ever, getting to my ranger station was my only priority. But I couldn't just abandon my post. 8 years of service had taught me that much. Every ranger worth his badge knew the cardinal rule. You don't leave your sector unfinished, not unless there's a genuine emergency. And what was I going to tell Supervisor Martinez? That I'd seen something big and scary in the woods? He'd laugh me out of the station. The rain from earlier had left the air thick and humid, carrying the earthy scent of wet palmetto fronds and decomposing leaves. But now, standing perfectly still on that muddy trail, I caught something else on the breeze. A smell I'd never encountered before, musky, pungent like wet dog mixed with something rotten. It made my stomach turn and my eyes water slightly. I clicked on my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Thompson on Sector 7. Everything's quiet out here." My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Copy that, Thompson. Keep up the good work. Martinez out." I clipped the radio back to my belt and tried to shake off the unease. 8 years of night patrols had shown me plenty of wildlife. Black bears, panthers, wild boar, all dangerous in their own right, but nothing that had ever made my skin crawl like this. Whatever I'd seen moved with purpose, intelligence even. It hadn't just wandered across the path. It had deliberately crossed from one side to the other, as if it knew exactly where it was going. The beam of my flashlight swept left and right as I continued down the trail, but the light seemed weaker somehow, swallowed by the oppressive darkness between the trees. Spanish moss hung like ghostly curtains from the oak branches overhead, and every shadow looked like it might conceal something watching me. My boots squelched in the mud as I approached the spot where the figure had disappeared into the palmettos. The distinctive saw-toothed fronds formed an almost impenetrable wall of green, even in the darkness. I knelt down and examined the ground with my flashlight. There, pressed deep into the soft earth beside a puddle, was an impression that made my blood freeze. It was a footprint, but not like any I'd seen in my years as a ranger. Easily twice the size of my own boot, with what appeared to be 4 distinct toe marks pressed into the mud. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy had made it. Something walking upright. I stared at that print for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. My training told me to document it, take photos, call it in, but something else, some deeper instinct, told me to get the hell away from that spot as quickly as possible. Because if there was one print, there had to be others, and if I could find its trail, then it could just as easily find mine. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond the palmettos. I didn't run. 8 years of discipline kept me from that, but I walked away from that footprint faster than I'd ever walked in my life, my hand unconsciously moving to rest on the pepper spray canister clipped to my utility belt. Behind me, the woods had fallen completely silent. No night birds, no insects, no small creatures rustling through the underbrush. Just the sound of my own breathing and the squelch of mud beneath my boots. By the time I reached the next checkpoint marker, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe normally, to think rationally. But rationality was hard to come by when every fiber of your being was screaming that you were being watched. I completed the rest of my patrol route in record time, checking each marker and reporting into base every 30 minutes as required. But my eyes never stopped scanning the tree line, and that sick feeling in my stomach never went away. Whatever I'd encountered out there, I knew with absolute certainty that it wasn't finished with me yet. The next morning, I couldn't get the image of that footprint out of my head. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning as I replayed every detail of the encounter. In the harsh light of day, sitting in my small apartment with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, I tried to convince myself it had been nothing more than an overactive imagination, combined with poor lighting and muddy conditions. But I knew better. I'd been in these woods for 8 years, and I knew the difference between shadows and reality. I called in sick to work, something I'd never done without actually being bedridden with fever. Martinez didn't sound happy about it, but he didn't question me either. I spent the morning on my laptop, researching large animals native to Florida that could have made a print like the one I'd seen. Black bears were the obvious candidate, but they typically left claw marks in their prints, and the impression I'd seen had been more elongated, more human-like. Florida panthers were too small. Wild boar left completely different tracks, and anyway, neither of those animals walked upright with the gait I'd witnessed. That's when I stumbled across an article about something called the skunk ape. According to the research I found, Florida has a long history of reported sightings of a bipedal, ape-like creature, particularly in the Everglades and surrounding forests. Multiple eyewitnesses have reported nocturnal encounters with a 5 to 7 foot ape-like creature, with dark red to black fur. The description matched what I'd seen perfectly. The more I read, the more my stomach churned. The earliest well-known skunk ape sighting happened in 1957, when a pair of hunters claimed that a gigantic smelly ape invaded their camp in the Everglades. There were dozens of documented encounters, some dating back to the 1940s. Most described the same thing, a large, hair-covered bipedal creature that moved quickly and silently through the swamps and forests. But it was the smell that really got my attention. The stench was described as kind of like a wet dog and a skunk mixed together. That putrid odor I'd caught on the wind suddenly made terrible sense. I found myself deep in forums dedicated to cryptozoology, reading first-hand accounts from people who claimed to have encountered these creatures. Most were easily dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but some had the ring of truth to them. Fellow law enforcement officers, park rangers, wildlife experts, people who spent their careers in the outdoors and knew what they were looking at. One account particularly caught my attention. A ranger from the Big Cypress National Preserve had reported multiple sightings over a 2-week period in 1997. His description of the creature's movement pattern was almost identical to what I'd witnessed, crossing roads and paths deliberately, as if following specific routes through its territory. By noon, I'd learned more about Florida's cryptid history than I'd ever wanted to know. The indigenous Seminole tribes had stories about these creatures going back centuries, calling them Estikapkaki, the tall man. Seminole legend says the Estikapkaki was cannibalistic, which did nothing to ease my growing anxiety. I tried calling my colleague, Ranger Davis, who'd been working these forests even longer than I had. Maybe he'd seen something similar. Maybe he could put my mind at ease with a rational explanation. Davis here. Hey, Mike, it's Thompson. I wanted to ask you something kind of strange. Shoot. In all your years out there, have you ever seen anything that you couldn't explain? something that didn't fit with the usual wildlife. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Davis finally spoke, his voice was quieter, more serious. "Why are you asking, Thompson?" "Just curious. Last night I thought I saw something unusual on my patrol route." Another pause. "What kind of unusual?" I described the encounter, leaving out some of the more unbelievable details but hitting the main points. Davis listened without interrupting. "Thompson," he said finally, "I'm going to give you some advice and I want you to listen carefully. There are things in these woods that don't make it into the guidebooks, things that don't fit neat categories. In my 23 years out there, I've learned that sometimes the best thing you can do is mind your own business and let sleeping dogs lie. So you have seen something. I've seen enough to know that these forests are older and stranger than most people realize, and I've learned that some questions are better left unasked." The line went dead. I stared at my phone for several minutes, trying to process what Davis had just told me. His non-answer was more disturbing than any confirmation would have been. If a veteran ranger like Davis was reluctant to discuss unusual encounters, what did that say about what was really out there? I spent the rest of the afternoon going through official incident reports, looking for any mentions of unusual wildlife encounters or unexplained sightings. Most were heavily redacted or filed under vague categories like unknown animal disturbance or unverified wildlife report. But between the lines, I could see a pattern. Reports clustered around certain areas that included my patrol route and tended to spike during periods of high rainfall or flooding. The storms we'd had over the past week suddenly took on new significance. If these creatures typically stayed deeper in the swamps, high water levels might have driven them to higher ground, right into my patrol sector. As the sun began to set, I found myself getting ready for work despite every instinct telling me to call in sick again. But I couldn't avoid the woods forever. I was a ranger and these were my forests. Whatever was out there, I needed to face it. I packed extra batteries for my flashlight, made sure my radio was fully charged, and clipped an additional canister of pepper spray to my belt. I even threw in a digital camera, just in case I needed to document anything. As I drove to the station, one thought kept running through my mind. If the skunk ape was real, and if it was territorial, then last night might have been more than just a chance encounter. It might have been a warning, and warnings were usually followed by something much worse. My second night back on patrol, I felt like I was walking into a trap of my own making. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more ominous. I'd requested a different sector, but Martinez had been short-staffed and insisted I stick to my usual route. "You know those trails better than anyone," he'd said. "No point in fixing what ain't broken." If only he knew how broken things really were. The rain had stopped, but the humidity hung in the air like a living thing. My uniform clung to my skin and sweat stung my eyes despite the relatively cool temperature. I'd been walking for about an hour, methodically checking each waypoint and trying to maintain some semblance of normal routine, when I first became aware that I was being followed. It started as just a feeling, that prickly sensation between your shoulder blades that tells you someone's watching. But feelings aren't evidence, so I kept walking. Then I began to notice the sounds, or rather the lack of them. The normal night chorus of crickets and frogs would go silent just before I reached certain stretches of trail, as if something large was moving parallel to my route, disturbing the wildlife as it went. I stopped frequently, pretending to adjust my gear while I listened intently. Once I thought I heard the soft splash of something large moving through standing water off to my right. Another time, the distinctive crack of a heavy branch being stepped on came from the thick undergrowth about 50 yards behind me. Whatever was out there, it was smart. It stayed far enough away that I never got a clear view, but close enough that I always knew it was there. This went on for nearly 2 hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse where I was definitely the mouse. My nerves were stretched taut as piano wire when I reached the section of trail where I'd had my first encounter. The muddy depression where I'd found the footprint had been washed smooth by the afternoon's rain, but something else had taken its place. Carved into the trunk of a massive cypress tree, about 7 feet off the ground, were 4 parallel gouges. They looked fresh, with sap still oozing from the wounds in the bark. Claw marks, but no bear I'd ever seen could reach that high while standing on its hind legs. I took photos with my digital camera, the flash seeming impossibly bright in the darkness. As I lowered the camera, a sound froze my blood in my veins. From somewhere in the darkness beyond the palmettos came a low, rumbling growl that rose and fell like a mournful song. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. Not quite human, but too intelligent to be purely animal. The sound seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the trees and water. When it finally faded, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the insects had stopped their nightly symphony. I keyed my radio with trembling fingers. Base, this is Thompson. I need backup at Waypoint 7, Sector 7. Possible dangerous wildlife encounter. Static answered me. I tried again, adjusting the frequency. Nothing but white noise. That's when I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and moving closer. Not the quick darting movement I'd witnessed before, but a slow, measured approach, like something that had decided it was done hiding. I drew my pepper spray and backed toward the center of the trail, trying to keep open ground on all sides. My flashlight beam swept frantically through the trees, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light just a few feet from where I stood. The footsteps stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound that might give away its position. The silence stretched on until I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then from directly in front of me came the sound of breathing. Deep, heavy breaths that formed visible puffs in the humid air. Whatever was out there was maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. "I know you're there," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm armed and backup is on the way." A lie, but hopefully a convincing one. The breathing stopped. For a moment I thought it might be retreating. Then I heard something that made every hair on my body stand on end. Laughter. Low, rumbling, and unmistakably intelligent. It sounded almost amused. That's when I ran. I'd like to say I made a tactical retreat, that I backed away slowly while maintaining situational awareness. But the truth is, I turned and sprinted down that muddy trail like my life depended on it. Behind me, I could hear heavy footsteps giving chase, but they stopped after maybe 50 yards. When I finally looked back, gasping for air and trembling with adrenaline, there was nothing there but darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my patrol vehicle, fumbling with the keys and locking the doors the moment I was inside. My radio crackled to life as soon as I started the engine. "Thompson, this is Base. You missed your scheduled check-in. Report your status. Base, this is Thompson. I had equipment failure. Radio was down. I'm heading back to the station now." "Copy that. Everything all right out there?" I looked back toward the trail, where something large was moving between the trees, just visible in my headlights. "Everything's fine, Base. See you in the morning." But as I drove away, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide with shock. I looked like a man who'd seen something that shouldn't exist, because that's exactly what I was. The thing that haunted me most as I drove back to town wasn't the size of the creature or even its obvious intelligence. It was that sound it had made. That low, rumbling laughter. It hadn't been afraid of me at all. In fact, it had found my fear amusing. I was no longer the predator in these woods. I was the prey, and tomorrow night I'd have to go back out there again. On my third night, I almost didn't show up for work at all. I sat in my truck outside the ranger station for 20 minutes, engine running, debating whether to drive straight home and tender my resignation in the morning. 8 years of service would look good on a resume. I could find work with private security, maybe get into building inspection or code enforcement, something that didn't require walking alone through haunted forests. But in the end, duty won out over fear. Or maybe it was pride. I'd never backed down from anything in my life, and I wasn't about to start now. This time, I came prepared for war, along with my standard gear. I'd packed a high-powered LED spotlight, extra batteries, and a military-grade air horn. I'd also managed to acquire something that wasn't exactly regulation issue, a taser. If whatever was out there wanted a confrontation, I'd give it one. The first part of my patrol passed without incident. Almost too quietly, in fact. The usual night sounds were muted, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. I completed the first half of my route in excellent time, checking each waypoint and maintaining regular radio contact with base. It wasn't until I approached the area where I'd had my previous encounters that things went sideways. The smell hit me first. That nauseating combination of wet fur and decay that I'd learned to associate with the creature. But this time it was stronger, more concentrated, as if the source was much closer than before. I clicked on the spotlight and began sweeping it through the trees. The powerful beam cut through the darkness like a sword, illuminating the Spanish moss and palmetto fronds in stark detail. For several minutes I saw nothing unusual. Then about 30 yards ahead, two red eyes reflected back at me from the shadows. They were positioned about 6 feet off the ground and spaced wide apart, like they belonged to something with a very large skull. As I watched, they moved, not the quick, darting movement of a startled animal, but a slow, deliberate turn, as if the creature was studying me as intently as I was studying it. "All right," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. "I know what you are. I've done my research. This is my territory and I'm not going anywhere." The eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just stared at me with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. I took a step forward, keeping the spotlight trained on those eyes. "You want to intimidate me? You want to play games? Let's see how you like this." I triggered the air horn. The sound was deafening, a harsh blare that shattered the silence and sent dozens of birds into panicked flight, but the eyes never moved. That's when I realized I was looking at something that had no fear of human technology, human weapons, or human authority, something that viewed me not as a threat but as an inconvenience. The eyes began to move toward me. There was no sound of footsteps this time, no crashing through underbrush. Whatever was approaching did so with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something of its apparent size. The eyes came closer, and with them, the overwhelming stench of wild animal and something else, something corrupt and ancient. I drew the taser, trying to remember the operating instructions I'd read online. Point, aim, fire. Simple enough if my hands would stop shaking. When the creature was maybe 10 feet away, still hidden in the shadows beyond my spotlight's reach, it stopped. For several heartbeats, we simply stared at each other. Then slowly it began to reveal itself. First came a massive hand, easily twice the size of my own, reaching out to push aside a palmetto frond. The fingers were long and powerful, ending in what looked like claws. Dark hair covered the entire appendage, but underneath I could see skin that was surprisingly human-like. Next came an arm, thick with muscle and covered in the same dark fur. Then a shoulder that was broader than any human shoulder had a right to be. And finally, a face. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen, and yet it was undeniably intelligent. The features were a disturbing blend of human and ape. Heavy brow ridge, flattened nose, wide mouth filled with large teeth. But the eyes held an awareness that was purely sentient. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This was a thinking creature, and it was evaluating me as carefully as I was evaluating it. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The creature towered over me, easily 7 feet tall and built like a power lifter. Its entire body was covered in coarse dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The smell coming off it was overwhelming. Wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else that reminded me of old blood. When it finally spoke, I nearly dropped the taser. "You should not be here." The voice was deep and rough, like gravel being poured from a great height. The words came slowly, as if speaking human language required considerable effort, but there was no mistaking the intelligence behind them, or the warning they contained. "This is my job," I managed to croak out. "I have to be here." The creature tilted its massive head, studying me with those unsettling red eyes. "Your job? We'll kill you. Are you threatening me?" Something that might have been a smile crossed its features, revealing teeth that looked capable of tearing through bone. No threat. Truth. I raised the taser, hoping it would be enough to make the creature back down. "I'm not afraid of you." This time there was no mistaking the laughter. It rumbled up from deep in the creature's chest, a sound like distant thunder. "Fear is wisdom. You should listen to fear. What do you want?" The creature took a step closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off its massive body. "Want you to leave. Find new territory. These woods are old, older than your kind. I can't just leave. I have responsibilities." Another step closer. Now I could see details I wished I couldn't. The way its nostrils flared as it scented the air, the thick muscles bunching beneath its fur, the intelligence gleaming in those terrible eyes. Responsibilities, to the dead, are meaningless. Before I could ask what that meant, the creature turned and melted back into the shadows with the same fluid grace it had displayed while approaching. Within seconds, it was as if it had never been there at all. Only the lingering stench and the memory of those burning red eyes proved the encounter had been real. I stood alone on that muddy trail for several minutes, taser still raised, spotlight still cutting through empty air. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might burst, and my legs felt like they were made of rubber. But I was alive, and more importantly, I was unharmed. The creature could have killed me easily. Instead, it had tried to warn me away. That should have been comforting. But somehow it only made everything worse. Because if something that formidable was trying to protect me from these woods, what the hell was really out there? As I walked back toward my patrol vehicle on unsteady legs, one phrase kept echoing in my mind. Responsibilities to the dead are meaningless. What had it meant by that? And more importantly, what did it know about these forests that I didn't? I had a terrible feeling I was about to find out. I didn't file a report about my encounter with the skunk ape. How could I? What would I say? That I'd had a conversation with a cryptid who'd advised me to find a new career. That a legendary creature had shown more concern for my welfare than my own supervisor. Instead, I spent my days off researching the history of the land I'd been patrolling. Property records, historical documents, newspaper archives, anything that might explain what the creature had meant. By its cryptic warning, what I found changed everything. The section of forest where I'd had my encounters hadn't always been wilderness. In the 1920s, it had been home to a small logging camp that had specialized in harvesting the massive cypress trees that dotted the swampland. The camp had employed nearly 40 men at its peak, mostly migrant workers who'd followed the lumber boom across the South. According to the records, the camp had shut down abruptly in 1926, following what the local newspaper had described as an industrial accident of unprecedented scale. The details were vague, but apparently, a section of the forest had been intentionally flooded to float cut logs downstream. Something had gone wrong, and the entire camp had been washed away in the resulting deluge. All 40 workers had been presumed dead, though only a handful of bodies were ever recovered. The land had been abandoned after that, eventually reverting to state ownership and becoming part of the protected forest system. But the more I dug into the story, the more inconsistencies I found. Witness accounts that didn't match official reports, unexplained delays in the search and rescue efforts, and most disturbing of all, several mentions of strange sounds and unusual wildlife activity in the area following the disaster. I drove out to the location during my next day off, this time in broad daylight and armed with a metal detector I'd borrowed from a friend. If there had once been a logging camp in these woods, there should be some trace of it. Metal tools, machinery, building foundations. I found all of that and more, about 100 yards from where I'd first encountered the creature. Hidden beneath decades of accumulated vegetation, I discovered the rusted remains of a steam-powered saw. Further exploration revealed the concrete foundations of several buildings, partially collapsed but still visible beneath the undergrowth, and scattered throughout the area, barely recognizable after nearly a century of decay, were personal items. A pocket watch, the remains of leather boots, broken tools. But it was what I found near the old mess hall foundation that made my blood run cold. Bones. Human bones. Bleached white by nearly a century of weather and picked clean by scavengers. Dozens of them, scattered across an area the size of a football field. Some were partially buried, others tangled in the roots of trees that had grown up around them. All showed signs of violent trauma. Broken ribs, cracked skulls, shattered limbs. These weren't the remains of men who had drowned in a flooding accident. These were the bones of people who had died violently, their bodies left unburied in the swamp for nature to reclaim. I was photographing one particularly disturbing skull. Its jaw was completely shattered, as if something had tried to crush it, when I heard familiar footsteps behind me. I turned slowly, unsurprised to find the skunk ape standing at the edge of the clearing. In daylight, it was even more imposing than it had been at night. Its dark fur was streaked with gray, suggesting advanced age, and there were old scars visible on its arms and torso. This was a creature that had survived for a very long time in a very dangerous place. "You found them," it said, its voice still rough but somehow sadder than before. "What happened here?" The creature moved closer, stepping carefully around the scattered bones. Men came, cut down the old trees, poisoned the water, drove away the animals. "So you killed them?" A long pause. "Not me, my father, his father. We are guardians. When the balance is broken, we restore it." I looked around at the scattered remains, trying to imagine the violence that had taken place here nearly a century ago. "You're talking about revenge. Talking about balance, these woods. We're here before your kind. We'll be here after. Some things are more important than individual lives. And now you're warning me away because you don't want to kill me too? The creature's expression might have been regret. You are different, not here to destroy, here to protect. But protection sometimes requires sacrifice, and what kind of sacrifice? The kind, your kind, are not willing to make. Before I could ask for clarification, the skunk ape began to retreat back into the forest, but it paused at the tree line and looked back at me one final time. Find new territory, it said. While you still can. I never saw the creature again. I transferred to a different patrol sector the following week, citing family obligations that required me to work closer to town. Martinez wasn't happy about it, but he approved the request. I finished out my remaining years with the Forest Service without any more supernatural encounters, eventually retiring to a small house near the coast. But I never forgot what I learned in those woods. The skunk ape wasn't just a cryptid or a legendary monster. It was something far more complex. A guardian, a protector, and when necessary, an executioner. It and its kind had been watching over those forests for generations, maintaining a balance that most humans couldn't even comprehend. The bones I'd found were eventually discovered by other rangers and attributed to the 1926 logging camp disaster. The official report described them as victims of the flooding, their remains scattered by decades of seasonal storms and animal activity. The violent trauma was explained away as post-mortem damage caused by falling trees and debris. I never contradicted that official version of events. What would be the point? Who would believe the truth? But sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside my bedroom window, I think about that final warning. The creature had told me that protection sometimes requires sacrifice and that my kind wasn't willing to make that sacrifice. I think it was talking about more than just the logging camp. I think it was talking about the future. Because the truth is, there are places in this world that belong to something older and more powerful than human civilization. Places where ancient agreements still hold sway, where the balance between mankind and nature is maintained by forces we don't understand and can't control. The skunk ape was one of those forces. And as long as we respect the boundaries it has set, as long as we remember that we are guests in its domain rather than masters of it, the balance will be maintained. But if we forget, if we push too far, take too much, destroy too carelessly, then the Guardians will act. Just as they did in 1926. Just as they have for centuries before that. And when that day comes, all our technology, all our weapons, all our civilization won't matter one bit. Because some responsibilities are older than law, older than government, older than human memory itself. And the dead, contrary to what we might believe, are never truly forgotten. They just wait in the shadows, patient as the trees themselves, for justice to finally be served. As I look back on this event and reflect, I believe I encountered a skunk ape, a creature native to the Florida Everglades and surrounding forests. While it was probably capable of great harm, it chose instead to show me something more valuable than violence. The truth about the land I thought I was protecting, and the guardians who had been protecting it long before I arrived. I still don't know if that creature was real in the way most people define reality. But that didn't matter, regardless of what it actually was. I'm convinced that whatever it was, it saved my life by teaching me when to walk away. And sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. I'd been working as a forest ranger for almost 5 years. A ranger's day could consist of anything from collecting firewood to tracking down missing hikers. And my day began like most. I would wake up early, walking into work, grabbing my binoculars. As I was about to drive out of the forest, I got a call. That day I was given a new assignment. I met up with another colleague. The morning air bit at my exposed skin as I stepped onto the porch of my cabin. The forest stretched before me, a sea of pines shrouded in mist. This was Black Ridge National Forest, my home and workplace for the past 5 years. My watch read 5:43 a.m., early but not unusual for a ranger. The sun wouldn't crest the eastern ridge for another hour, but I preferred these quiet moments before the day officially began. My cabin sat a quarter-mile from the ranger station, close enough for convenience but distant enough to maintain the solitude I'd grown to cherish. The gravel path crunched beneath my boots as I made my way toward the station. Mentally cataloging the day's routine tasks, check the south trail for storm damage, replace the faded warning signs at Crescent Falls, and patrol the campgrounds. Inside the station, I hung my jacket on the wooden peg by the door and nodded to Mark, the night shift dispatcher who looked ready to collapse into bed. "Quiet night?" I asked, pouring coffee into my thermos. Mark yawned, stretching his arms overhead. "Too quiet. Makes me nervous when it's like this. Like something's waiting to happen." I chuckled, though I understood the sentiment. 5 years in these woods had taught me to respect the strange silences that occasionally fell over Blackridge. They often preceded something unexpected. Weather changes, animal migrations, or the occasional lost hiker who'd wandered off trail. "Better than the alternative," I said, grabbing my gear from the locker. Radio, first aid kit, multi-tool compass, map, and binoculars. The essentials of forest rangering. I checked each item methodically before placing them in their respective pockets and attachments on my uniform. I was halfway to my truck when the radio on my hip crackled to life. "Charlie, you there?" "Over." It was Diane, the morning dispatcher who'd just relieved Mark. I unclipped the radio. "Go ahead, Diane, over. We've got a situation. Roberts wants you to meet him at Junction 14. Priority 2. Over." Junction 14 was about 20 minutes east of the station, where the main access road split toward the popular hiking areas. Priority 2 meant it wasn't life-threatening but required immediate attention. On my way. "Ada, 20 minutes over." The ranger truck roared to life and I pulled away from the station, headlights cutting through the lingering darkness. The forest was different in these early hours, more primal, more secretive. Shadows stretched across the road and the trees seemed to lean inward, as if sharing whispers I wasn't meant to hear. As I drove, my mind wandered to what Roberts might want. Dave Roberts was the senior ranger, my direct supervisor and not someone who called meetings without good reason. We'd worked together on everything from wildfire containment to wildlife management, and I respected his judgment. If he thought something warranted attention, it did. Junction 14 came into view and I spotted Roberts' vehicle parked at the turnout. He was leaning against the hood, arms crossed, staring into the forest. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his posture. I parked alongside him and killed the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, loaded with something I couldn't identify. "Morning, Dave," I said, approaching. Roberts turned, his weathered face grim in the early light. At 52, he'd spent more than half his life protecting these woods. The lines around his eyes had deepened since I'd first met him, and the salt in his pepper hair had gradually overtaken the pepper. "Charlie," he acknowledged with a nod. "Thanks for coming so quickly. What's going on?" Roberts gestured toward the northeast. "Cave system. You know the one." I did know it. Blackridge Caverns was a major tourist attraction during the summer months, a sprawling underground network of limestone passages and chambers. Parts were developed for guided tours, but the system extended far beyond the mapped areas, with unknown entrances scattered throughout the forest. "What about it?" "We've had 3 reports in the past week. People hearing screams coming from around the cave area." Roberts ran a hand through his hair. "Not animal sounds. Human. Or at least that's what they're saying." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept up my spine. "Any missing persons reports?" "None so far. But these reports are consistent, and they're from experienced hikers, not jumpy tourists. Something's going on." I nodded, processing the information. "Want me to check it out?" "That's why I called you. You know those caves better than most of the team." He paused, then added, "Take Morgan with you. Safety protocols." Morgan Chen was another ranger, relatively new but competent. We'd worked together on a few assignments, and I found him reliable if somewhat by the book. "Where is he?" I asked, looking around. Roberts checked his watch. "Should be here any minute." As if on cue, headlights appeared around the bend and Morgan's vehicle pulled into the junction. "I'll let you two handle this. Report back by radio if you find anything, and for God's sake, don't take unnecessary risks. Those caves can be treacherous." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of foreboding settle over me. It wasn't just the reports of screams, it was something more instinctual, a primal warning that tickled at the base of my skull. Morgan approached, equipment bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "What's the situation?" As Roberts briefed him, I found myself staring into the forest toward where I knew the cave system lay. The trees seemed darker in that direction, more densely packed, unwelcoming. For a moment I could have sworn I heard something, a distant sound carried on the wind, halfway between a moan and a whisper. But when I strained to listen, there was only silence. My fellow ranger and I went to the center of this area where somebody had been reporting hearing strange screaming coming from around a cave system nearby. My partner and I decided that I would be able to handle it by myself. He had other things to do, and this was just another run-of-the-mill investigation for me. After he left, I headed towards that area where there had been several unreported mounds to this cave system. Morgan and I drove in silence toward the cave system, the morning sun finally breaking through the trees. The forest seemed to awaken around us, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, but I couldn't shake the unease that had taken root since Roberts's briefing. "So," Morgan said, breaking the silence, "have you dealt with anything like this before?" I considered the question. False alarms, sure. Hikers misinterpreting natural sounds. Wind through rock formations can sound eerily human sometimes. I paused. But 3 separate reports in a week? That's unusual. Morgan nodded, his expression thoughtful. At 32, he was only a few years younger than me, but his face retained a youthfulness that mine had long since surrendered to the elements. 2 years in the Rangers had given him confidence, but not the bone-deep weariness that sometimes came with the job. "I've been reading about the cave system," he said. "The geological survey from 2018 suggested it might be twice as extensive as previously mapped. Wouldn't surprise me. I've seen some of the unofficial entrances hikers have found, just holes in the ground that drop right into unmapped tunnels." We parked at the main entrance to Black Ridge Caverns, a developed area with informational signs and maintained pathways. During tourist season, this lot would be filled with cars and buses. Now in early November, it was deserted. "Where were the screams reported?" Morgan asked as we gathered our equipment. I pulled out the map Roberts had given me. "Here, here, and here." I pointed to 3 locations marked in red. All within a half-mile radius, but none near the main entrance. Morgan studied the map. "That's all undeveloped territory. Some of it's probably not even properly surveyed. Exactly why we need to check it out." We set out along the forest path that circled the known perimeter of the cave system. The air grew colder as we walked, despite the climbing sun. Morgan took readings of the temperature, frowning at his thermometer. "Drop of almost 10 degrees in the last 100 yards, he noted. "That normal around here?" I shook my head. Cold spots happen near cave entrances, but not this dramatic. We continued, making our way toward the first reported location. The forest grew denser, the trail less defined. Signs of human presence faded. No footpaths, no trash, no carved initials in trees. This was the wilderness proper, the part of Black Ridge that remained largely untouched. As we approached the first marker on our map, Morgan suddenly stopped. "Did you hear that?" I froze, listening. At first, there was nothing but the normal forest sounds, but then, faintly at the edge of perception, a sound carried on the wind. A drawn-out moan that raised the hair on my arms. "Could be the wind," I said. But even to my ears, the explanation sounded hollow. Morgan's face had paled slightly. That didn't sound like wind. We pressed on, more cautiously now. The ground beneath our feet changed, becoming rockier, with occasional sinkholes and depressions, signs of the cave system running beneath us. "We should split up," Morgan suggested after we'd thoroughly investigated the first location and found nothing but a small fissure in the rock face. Too narrow for anything larger than a fox to enter. "Cover more ground," I hesitated. Safety protocols dictated we stay together, especially in potentially dangerous terrain. But time was a factor and daylight a finite resource. "All right," I agreed reluctantly. "You take the eastern marker, I'll check the northern one. Radio check every 15 minutes and we meet back here in 2 hours regardless of what we find. Deal?" Morgan nodded, adjusting his pack. "Deal. Be careful out there, Charlie." "You too." We separated and I headed north through the increasingly rocky terrain. The forest had taken on a strange quality, quieter, as if the normal wildlife had abandoned this section. The temperature continued to drop, my breath forming clouds that lingered before dissipating. After 20 minutes of careful navigation, I approached the northern marker. The area was dominated by a massive ancient oak, its trunk twisted and gnarled, one solitary branch extending like a withered arm. At its base, partially hidden by fallen leaves, was a depression in the ground. I radioed Morgan for the scheduled check-in. Found something at the northern point. Some kind of opening. Going to investigate. Copy that. His voice crackled through the static. Nothing here yet. Be careful. I approached the depression, clearing away leaves and debris. What revealed itself was a crude hole, roughly 5 feet in diameter, descending at a steep angle into darkness. The edges were jagged, as if the earth had simply collapsed into a void below. This wasn't a natural formation. At least, not entirely. The hole looked too symmetrical, too purposeful. I shone my flashlight down but couldn't see the bottom, just a rough tunnel sloping downward at about 45 degrees. I should have waited for Morgan. I should have reported back to Roberts. I should have done anything except what I did next. I secured a rope to the oak tree, tested it with my weight, and prepared to descend into the hole. Just as I was about to lower myself down, the wind picked up dramatically, swirling around me with unexpected force. The temperature plummeted further, my skin prickling with goosebumps beneath my uniform. And then I heard it, clear and unmistakable. A scream. Human in its inflection, but wrong somehow, as if filtered through something inhuman. It came from below, echoing up through the hole at my feet. "Hello?" I called down, my voice bouncing back to me. "This is Forest Ranger Charlie Hayes. Do you need assistance?" Silence answered me, thick and oppressive. I radioed Morgan again. "I'm hearing what sounds like a person in distress. Going to check it out. Send backup to my location if I don't respond in 30 minutes. Wait, Charlie, don't..." I switched off the radio, cutting off his protest. Someone might be hurt down there, and minutes could make the difference between life and death. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was more complicated. A mixture of duty and a strange, almost magnetic pull toward that darkness below. With one last look at the gray November sky, I began my descent into the earth. Let me give you some information. This cave system runs pretty deep and there are guided tours. But I also know that this cave system is very expansive and also having a lot of unidentified entrances and holes that can lean deeper into the system. These are also off trail, so myself, I've never actually experienced finding more of these. The descent was awkward, a controlled slide more than a climb, with the rough stone scraping against my uniform as I lowered myself into the darkness. The air grew colder with every foot, carrying a damp, mineral smell that grew increasingly pungent. After about 15 feet, my boots touched solid ground. I was in a small chamber, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, with a low ceiling that forced me to hunch slightly. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing limestone walls glistening with moisture. 3 tunnels branched from this chamber, one directly ahead, one to the left, and one to the right. I tried the radio, but as expected, there was no signal this far underground. I was on my own. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft drip of water somewhere in the distance and my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. I checked my watch, 2:17 p.m. Morgan would be sending help within half an hour if I didn't return or make contact. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing down each of the tunnels. "Is anyone down here? Call out if you can hear me." No response. I marked the entrance tunnel with a glow stick, standard procedure for cave exploration, and decided to try the tunnel directly ahead first. It was slightly larger than the others and showed signs of water erosion, suggesting it might be part of a more developed system. As I moved forward, I mentally reviewed what I knew about Black Ridge Caverns. The tourist section covered about 2 miles of passages with safety measures, lighting, and walkways installed throughout. But geological surveys suggested the cave system might extend for 20 miles or more beneath the forest, with most passages unmapped and unexplored. The tunnel narrowed as I progressed, forcing me to crouch lower. The walls changed from smooth limestone to rougher stone, with strange, almost organic-looking formations protruding at irregular intervals. My light caught something on the ground, a footprint in the soft mud. I crouched to examine it. Not a boot print or hiking shoe, but something else, broader at the front with what looked like elongated toe impressions. Not quite human, but not clearly animal either. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. The tunnel suddenly widened into another chamber, larger than the first. My flashlight couldn't illuminate it entirely, the beam swallowed by the vastness. I stepped forward cautiously, sweeping the light across the space. The floor dropped away into a natural pit, perhaps 20 feet deep. Around the edges of the pit, the ground was disturbed as if something had been dragged to the edge and pushed over. I approached carefully, shining my light down. The beam revealed the bottom of the pit, covered in a strange, sticky-looking substance that glistened in the light. And something else, fabric. Torn and muddied, but unmistakably a piece of clothing. A hiking jacket, its blue color barely visible beneath the dirt and that strange, viscous coating. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was evidence, potential evidence of a missing person, though no reports had been filed. I needed to document this to bring back proof. I took out my phone and tried to take photos, but the screen flashed a warning about low temperature affecting battery life before shutting down completely. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming momentarily before returning to full strength. A sound echoed from somewhere deeper in the cave system, a shuffling, dragging noise like something heavy being moved across stone, then silence again. I should have left then, should have retreated to the surface and returned with a proper team. But the thought of someone trapped deeper in the system, possibly injured, compelled me forward. I continued past the pit chamber, following a tunnel that sloped gently downward. The air changed subtly, still cold but carrying a new scent, something organic and unpleasant, like rotting vegetation mixed with a coppery tang that reminded me of blood. The tunnel forked, and I hesitated. The left passage was narrower but seemed to curve upward slightly. The right was wider but continued downward. Upward might lead to an exit, to safety. Downward would take me deeper into the unknown. I chose the right passage, telling myself it was because the dragging sound had come from that direction. The truth was more complex, a growing, inexplicable compulsion to descend further, to discover what lay hidden in these depths. The passage widened as I moved deeper, the ceiling rising until I could stand upright again. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished in places as if worn by constant contact. And there were markings, not graffiti or modern human signs, but something older, more primitive. Crude symbols etched into the stone depicting what might have been stick figures with too many limbs. My flashlight flickered again, longer this time. I smacked it against my palm and the beam stabilized, but noticeably dimmer than before. The battery was failing much faster than it should have, even in these cold conditions. I quickened my pace, the uneasy feeling in my gut growing stronger. The passage opened into a vast cavern, so large my light couldn't reach the opposite wall. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like massive stone teeth, some reaching all the way to the floor to form columns. And there was sound here, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from the stone itself, vibrating through my boots and into my bones. It wasn't mechanical, more like a massive heartbeat, slow and deliberate. As I ventured further into the cavern, my light revealed more disturbing details. The floor was covered in that same sticky substance I'd seen in the pit, thicker here, forming pools in the depressions of the rock. And there were objects embedded in it. Hiking gear, torn clothing, a broken camera, a child's stuffed animal. My breath caught in my throat. These were personal items, belongings, evidence of people who had come here and... What? What had happened to them? I approached one of the larger pools of the viscous substance, crouching to examine it more closely. It moved slightly as if disturbed by my presence, rippling outward from where my light touched it. My flashlight flickered once more, then died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. Panic surged through me, hot and electric. I fumbled in my pocket for spare batteries, my fingers clumsy with fear. The darkness pressed against me, an almost physical weight, and the rhythmic pulsing grew louder, faster, as if responding to my fear. Then, a sound. A wet sliding noise followed by a soft clicking that reminded me of insect mandibles. It was close, too close. The spare batteries tumbled from my shaking hands, clattering to the stone floor. I dropped to my knees, hands sweeping desperately across the ground, searching. My fingers touched something warm and yielding that wasn't the floor, and I recoiled instinctively. My hand found a battery, then another. Working blindly, guided only by touch and the increasing sounds of movement around me, I managed to replace the batteries and twist the cap of the flashlight closed. I pressed the switch, and nothing happened. I tried again, tapping the flashlight against my palm in desperation. On the third attempt, it flickered weakly to life. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what stood before me, and I screamed. although I know hikers have reported finding many, and even leaving makeshift markers to let other hikers know this was an entrance. Parts of the ground here were also dangerous, meaning if you step on the wrong part, the ground below you could collapse, falling into a tunnel. So I had to be very careful about how I approached this entire search. The good news is I wasn't hearing any screaming. The creature before me defied rational explanation. It stood perhaps 7 feet tall, humanoid in its basic structure but wrong in every detail. Its skin, if it could be called that, was a mottled gray-black, glistening with moisture in the weak beam of my flashlight. Where a human would have a face, this thing had only a series of black reflective orbs that I realized with horror were eyes. Dozens of them, arranged in clusters across what should have been a head. Its limbs were too long, too jointed, ending in appendages that were neither hands nor paws but something in between. Elongated digits tipped with curved, chitinous claws. And from its back what looked like vestigial appendages twitched and writhed, reminiscent of spider legs but partially absorbed into the torso. Time seemed to stop as we regarded each other. Me, frozen in terror, and this thing, motionless except for the subtle shifting of its many eyes, each one adjusting independently to focus on me. My flashlight beam wavered as my hand trembled uncontrollably. The creature tilted what passed for its head, a curious gesture that was somehow more terrifying for its almost human quality. It made a sound, that same clicking I'd heard earlier, but now accompanied by a low hum that seemed to resonate in my chest. Was it communicating? Warning me? I couldn't tell, and I didn't want to find out. Slowly, I began to back away, keeping the light trained on the creature. It didn't advance, but I sensed its attention intensifying, those clusters of eyes reflecting my light back at me like a field of tiny mirrors. A sound from behind me, the same clicking, but in a different rhythm. I whirled around, swinging my flashlight toward the new threat. Another creature, smaller than the first but with the same basic structure, emerged from a crevice in the wall I hadn't noticed before. This one moved differently, more fluid, almost graceful in its inhuman way. Its clicking grew more rapid, directed at the larger creature rather than at me. They were communicating. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. These weren't animals acting on instinct. There was intelligence here, alien and unknowable, but intelligence nonetheless. I had to get out. Now. I lunged to the right, away from both creatures toward what I hoped was the passage I'd used to enter the cavern. The sudden movement triggered an immediate response. Both creatures emitted a high-pitched keening that hurt my ears, and the larger one moved with shocking speed to intercept me. I ducked under its reaching limbs, feeling the rush of air as claws passed inches from my face. The smaller one scuttled across the ceiling, positioning itself to drop down in my path. Pure adrenaline drove me forward. I zigzagged between stalagmites, splashing through pools of that viscous fluid, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. The creatures pursued, their movements becoming more coordinated, working to herd me away from the exit. I reached the passage I'd entered through, only to find a third creature blocking it, larger than the other two, its body more heavily armored with what looked like plates of hardened chitin. This one didn't move with the same agility as the others. Instead, it stood its ground, a living barrier between me and escape. Trapped between the advancing pair and this immovable sentinel, I frantically searched for another way out. The cavern had multiple exits. I'd seen at least 3 other passages branching off, but I had no idea where they led. Deeper into the system? To dead ends? To more creatures? The third creature, the largest, began to produce a low rhythmic vibration that I felt rather than heard. A subsonic pulse that made my vision blur and my equilibrium falter. Was this how they hunted? Some kind of disorientation technique? Fighting against the vertigo, I spotted a narrow fissure in the wall to my left, barely visible in the shadows. It might be too small for the creatures to follow. It was my only chance. I feinted right, then pivoted sharply left, sprinting for the fissure. The smaller creature dropped from the ceiling directly in my path, but I was ready this time. I slid baseball-style beneath it, feeling something wet and cold drip onto my back as I passed under its body. The fissure was tight, tighter than I'd estimated, but desperation lent me strength. I squeezed through sideways, the rough stone scraping against my chest and back, tearing my uniform and scraping skin beneath. Behind me, Claws scrabbled at the opening, too large to follow. The narrow passage continued for perhaps 20 feet before widening enough for me to move more freely. I didn't slow down, pushing forward blindly, guided only by the weakening beam of my flashlight and the instinctual drive to put distance between myself and those things. The passage curved upward, giving me hope that it might lead to the surface. The air seemed slightly fresher, the oppressive feeling of the deep cavern gradually lifting. I paused to catch my breath, listening. The clicking and humming had faded, but I could still hear something. A distant scratching, as if the creatures were searching for another way to reach me. They weren't giving up. My radio crackled suddenly, startling me so badly I nearly dropped my flashlight. Through bursts of static, I heard Morgan's voice. "Arlie? Come in. Location back up." I was getting close to the surface if the radio was picking up signals again. I pressed on, the passage continuing its upward trend before abruptly ending at a vertical shaft. Looking up, I could see a circle of gray light perhaps 30 feet above. An exit. There were no convenient handholds, no ladder, just smooth limestone walls worn by water over millennia. But there was a narrow chimney-like structure, a tight fit, but possibly climbable using pressure from my back and legs. As I prepared to attempt the climb, a new sound reached me. That same wet, sliding noise I'd heard before, but now coming from below. They'd found another way to follow me. I wedged myself into the chimney and began to climb, using the technique I'd learned in ranger training, back against one wall, feet against the other, pushing upward in small increments. It was slow, exhausting work, my muscles screaming in protest, but the gray light above grew gradually closer. 20 feet up, I heard them enter the passage below. The clicking was more urgent now, excited. They knew I was trapped. 15 feet to go. My foot slipped, and I slid down several feet before managing to brace myself again. Below, the creatures emitted that keening sound again. Anticipation. Triumph. 10 feet. My arms were trembling with exhaustion, my back raw from scraping against the stone. But the light was closer now, and I could feel a gentle breeze on my face. 5 feet. The first creature appeared below, its cluster of eyes reflecting my dropped flashlight that still burned weakly on the ground. It began to climb, using its multiple limbs to ascend with terrifying ease. I made a final desperate push, ignoring the pain and fatigue. My hand reached the edge of the opening, fingers digging into soft earth. With the last of my strength, I pulled myself up and out, collapsing onto the forest floor. I was back in the woods, perhaps 100 yards from where I'd first descended. The hole I'd emerged from was smaller, partially hidden by undergrowth, another unknown entrance to the cave system. The sound of clicking rose from the hole, closer now. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not daring to look back, driven by the certainty that those things were right behind me, reaching for me with their inhuman limbs. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, the forest blurring around me. Only when I broke through the tree line and saw the ranger station in the distance did I finally slow, glancing back over my shoulder. The forest was still. No pursuit, no sign of the creatures, just the normal sounds of birds and wind through the trees, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just encountered something impossible. I staggered to the station, my uniform torn and filthy, streaked with that strange viscous substance and my own blood from dozens of small cuts and abrasions. Morgan was there, along with Roberts and a search team preparing to head out. Their expressions of relief quickly turned to concern as they took in my appearance. "Charlie, what the hell happened to you?" Roberts demanded, guiding me to a chair. I opened my mouth to tell them, then closed it again. What could I say? That I'd found monsters in the cave? That there were things living beneath our forest that defied explanation? I fell, I said finally. Went into one of the cave entrances and lost my footing. Had to find another way out. Morgan frowned. We heard screaming on the radio. Was that you? Had it been? I couldn't remember screaming. But those moments in the cavern were already blurring in my mind as if my brain was trying to protect me from the memory. Must have been, I agreed. Hit my head when I fell. I'm fine now. Roberts didn't look convinced, but he nodded slowly. You need medical attention. Those cuts could get infected. As they led me to the first aid station, I glanced back toward the forest. For just a moment, I thought I saw movement among the trees, something tall and misshapen watching with too many eyes. But when I blinked, it was gone. So that could be good or bad news. The bad news meaning the hiker, whoever was stuck there, could have been deceased or what. But the good news being that maybe the hiker had gotten themselves out. Anyway, my heart was pounding just by the sheer adrenaline of it. I didn't know why, but something told me to run. It was this feeling in the pit of my gut. As soon as I got there, right around the cavern system, the wind picked up and everything seemed colder than it already was. 2 weeks passed after my encounter in the caves. 2 weeks of sleepless nights, of jumping at shadows, of convincing myself that what I'd seen wasn't real, couldn't be real. I threw myself into routine ranger duties, patrolling the safe, familiar trails and avoiding the northeastern section of the forest where the cave system lay. Morgan asked questions at first, clearly not believing my story about a simple fall, but when I maintained the lie, he eventually stopped pressing. Roberts put me on light duty for a week, concerned about possible concussion, which gave me time to process what had happened, or try to. I researched cave-dwelling creatures, looking for any scientific explanation for what I'd encountered. Cave adaptations could produce strange evolutionary outcomes: albinism, blindness, elongated appendages, but nothing that could explain what I'd seen. Nothing that walked on 2 legs, communicated with clicks and hums, and watched with clusters of eyes. As the days passed, I began to wonder if I had hit my head. If the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by a combination of concussion, isolation, and the strange acoustics of the cave system. It was a comforting thought, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Then the reports started coming in. First, a family camping in the eastern campground reported strange noises during the night, clicking sounds and what they described as whispering without words coming from the woods. They packed up and left before morning. Then hikers on the northeastern trail found strange markings on trees, deep gouges arranged in patterns that weren't consistent with any known animal. Rangers dismissed it as vandalism, but I knew better. The patterns matched the symbols I'd seen etched into the cave walls. Finally, a backpacker went missing. Jacob Mercer, 27, experienced outdoorsman. Last seen heading toward the hiking trails near the cave system. Search parties were organized, grid patterns established, helicopters deployed with thermal imaging. Nothing. I volunteered for the search, despite the cold dread that settled in my stomach at the thought of returning to that part of the forest. I told myself it was because I knew the area, but the truth was more complicated. I needed to know if what I'd seen was real. I needed proof one way or another. 3 days into the search, I found myself alone near the massive oak tree where I'd first descended into the cave system. The hole I'd used was now blocked with rocks and soil, not a natural collapse but deliberately filled in. Someone or something had sealed it. I stood there staring at the disturbed earth when my radio crackled. All search teams, we've found something. Converge on grid coordinate E7. E7 was less than a quarter mile from my position. I headed there immediately, both dreading and anticipating what they might have found. A small crowd of rangers and volunteers had gathered in a clearing when I arrived. In the center, Roberts crouched next to what appeared to be a backpack, Mercer's presumably. But it was the state of the backpack that sent ice through my veins. It had been torn apart, not by animal claws or teeth, but precisely, methodically, as if someone had wanted to examine its construction. The contents were arranged in a neat circle around it. Clothes folded, food items organized by type, electronics disassembled into component parts. What could have done this? One of the volunteers whispered. Roberts shook his head. Not what. Who? This is human activity. I knew better, but I said nothing, my eyes drawn to the ground around the bizarre display. There, partially obscured by fallen leaves, were those same strange footprints I'd seen in the cave, broad at the front, with elongated toe impressions. They'd come out of the caves. They were in our forest now. The search continued for 2 more days before being scaled back. No trace of Jacob Mercer was found beyond his dissected belongings. The official report would eventually list him as missing, presumed dead, another statistic in the long history of people who venture into wilderness areas and never return. I requested reassignment the following week, citing personal reasons. Roberts was understanding, if confused by my sudden desire to transfer to a ranger station on the opposite side of the state. Morgan threw me a small going-away gathering my last day, and I played along, smiling and reminiscing about my 5 years at Black Ridge while inwardly counting the hours until I could leave. The night before my departure, I sat alone on the porch of my cabin, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside me. The forest stretched before me, dark and secretive, the trees swaying gently in the autumn wind. It looked so normal, so familiar. The same forest I'd worked in for 5 years, the same forest I'd grown to love. But I knew better now. I knew what lived beneath it, what might even now be finding new ways to the surface, drawn by curiosity or hunger or some alien motivation I couldn't begin to comprehend. I should tell someone. The truth, not the sanitized version I'd given Roberts and the others. I should report what I'd seen, what I knew was out there. But who would believe me? Without evidence, without proof, I'd be dismissed as traumatized, delusional, or worse. And if they did believe me, what then? Scientific expeditions into the caves? Military involvement? The forest closed off, studied? Perhaps even destroyed in an effort to eliminate the perceived threat? These creatures, whatever they were, had been there before us. Perhaps they'd always been there, living beneath our feet, watching with their clusters of eyes as humans built cities and roads and national parks above them. They hadn't emerged before, hadn't interfered with our world until now. What had changed? Was it random chance that I'd encountered them, or had they wanted to be found? Were they simply defending their territory? Or was their behavior that day in the cave something else? Assessment, evaluation, first contact. I didn't know, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. Morning came, and with it the time to leave. I loaded the last of my belongings into my truck and took a final look at the cabin that had been my home. In the distance, the forest was shrouded in mist, the cave system hidden beyond the rolling hills and dense trees. As I drove away, following the winding road that would take me out of Black Ridge National Forest for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not just by the creatures from the cave, but by the forest itself, ancient and knowing. I've kept this secret for a while, but how long can I keep it from the rest of the world? Will my story ever be told to other people? Or should I just stay quiet about what had happened? The question haunts me still, as I settle into my new position at Pinecrest Ranger Station, 200 miles in a mountain range away from Black Ridge. I check the news obsessively, searching for reports of missing hikers, strange sightings, unexplained phenomena near my former home. There's been nothing so far. No mass disappearances, no eyewitness accounts of monsters, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary is happening at Black Ridge National Forest. Perhaps it was just me. Perhaps those creatures with their alien intelligence selected me specifically to test, to study, to warn. Perhaps they've returned to their subterranean world, content to remain hidden for another century or millennium. Or perhaps they're simply biding their time, learning, adapting, preparing for something I can't begin to imagine. I don't know which possibility terrifies me more. What I do know is that I can never look at a cave entrance the same way again. I can never hear the wind whistling through rocks without thinking of that clicking language. I can never see a spider without remembering those too many eyes, watching me with cold intelligence. And I know that somewhere, beneath the familiar surface of our world, they're still there, waiting, watching, clicking in the darkness. Search and rescue missions are never exactly easy. They can prove to be incredibly emotionally and physically difficult at times. Along with managing a team and making sure everybody is diehard and on the same page as you, and managing a team can be even more difficult. Not only is it incredibly strenuous, but it also drains resources, time, and everyone's emotional energy. This search and rescue mission had been no different when we had come across an abandoned campsite. There were 7 campers in total who had been now reported missing. And this was right in the middle of a national park that is known to have extremely dangerous weather patterns, and even lately, even more so with the unpredictable weather. There had been a storm brewing, coming in from the west when we began working our way, higher up ground. The call had come in at 3:17 a.m., I remember, because I'd just managed to fall asleep after a 20-hour shift the day before. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, illuminating the darkened bedroom with its harsh blue light. My wife Caroline stirred beside me but didn't wake. She'd grown accustomed to these late-night interruptions over our 12 years of marriage. "Mitchell," I answered, my voice thick with sleep. "John, it's Pete. We've got a situation at Blackwood Ridge." Pete Danvers was the park's lead ranger, and he never called unless it was serious. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, already reaching for my clothes. "How many?" 7. Group of friends on a weekend camping trip. Should have checked in with the ranger station yesterday afternoon. Never showed. I rubbed my eyes, processing the information. Weather status. Not good. Storm system moving in from the west. Weather service is predicting heavy snowfall by tomorrow afternoon. Temperatures already dropping. Shit, I muttered. Blackwood National Park was unforgiving on the best of days. With a storm coming in, we'd be racing against more than just time. Any comms from them at all? Nothing since they registered their campsite location 3 days ago. Last known position was near Crater Lake, about 7 miles in from the east entrance. I'll assemble the team. Meet at Basin 40. Copy that. I ended the call and finished dressing in silence, my mind already mapping out the search grid, calculating resources, and assembling the team roster. As search and rescue coordinator for Blackwood County, I'd overseen hundreds of operations over the past 15 years. Some successful, others less so. The mountains didn't give up their victims easily. Caroline's voice came from the darkness. Be careful out there, John. I leaned down and kissed her forehead. Always am. Go back to sleep. Bring them home, she whispered as I headed for the door. I'll try, I answered. The same exchange we'd had countless times before. The drive to the SAR headquarters took 20 minutes along empty pre-dawn roads. The temperature gauge in my truck showed 28 degrees, and I could see my breath inside the cab until the heater finally kicked in. By the time I pulled into the lot, several vehicles were already there, the core team members responding to my text alert. Inside, the operations room buzzed with quiet efficiency as my team prepared. Maps were being unfurled, equipment checked, and communication protocols established. Melissa Chen, my second-in-command and best tracker, looked up as I entered. 7 missing near Crater Lake, she said. Not a question, but a confirmation. I nodded, shrugging off my jacket. Pete's bringing the details. Storm system moving in fast. Timer's already running, she replied, tapping her watch. The unspoken reality hung in the air between us. In these temperatures, with a storm approaching, the missing hikers had perhaps 48 hours before hypothermia claimed them, and that was assuming they were uninjured and properly equipped. Pete arrived 10 minutes later with the missing persons information. The 7 hikers were friends from college. Jason Mercer, 31, Eliza Carpenter, 30, Daniel and Sophia Rodriguez, both 32, Trevor Winters, 33, Alyssa Newman, 29, and Kyle Braddock, 31. All were experienced outdoors people with several previous trips to Blackwood under their belts. Last communication? I asked, studying their registration forms. Jason texted his girlfriend 3 days ago, Pete said, sliding his phone across to me. Said they'd made camp and were going to explore some caves they'd found nearby. I read the message, made it to the spot. Found some cool caves not on any maps. Going to check them out tomorrow. Service spotty, but we'll call when back in range. Love you. Caves? I looked up at Pete. There aren't any major cave systems in that sector. Pete shrugged. Nothing in our official records. But you know how Blackwood is, the geology's always shifting, especially with all the seismic activity lately. He wasn't wrong. The park sat along a minor fault line, and we'd recorded increased tremor activity over the past year. Nothing major, but enough to potentially open new sinkholes or cave entrances. By 5 a.m., we had assembled our full team, 12 searchers, 4 handlers with search dogs, a medic, and a communications specialist. The morning briefing was quick and to the point. We'd deploy in 3 teams, covering the area in a systematic grid pattern, starting from the hikers' last known location. Remember, I told them, the clock is ticking and Mother Nature isn't on our side. Stay in radio contact, check in every 30 minutes, and if you find anything at all, report it immediately. These people are counting on us. We loaded into the Park Service vehicles and headed out as the first hints of dawn crept over the eastern ridge. The forecast had worsened overnight. The storm was now expected to hit by nightfall rather than the following afternoon. Every minute counted. The drive to the east entrance took an hour, and another 2 hours of hiking brought us to the coordinates of the registered campsite. The rising sun did little to warm the air, which felt brittle with cold. My breath formed thick clouds with each exhale, and the trees around us creaked and groaned under the weight of ice that had formed during the night. Spread out, I ordered as we approached the clearing. Standard search pattern. Document everything. The campsite appeared as an eerie tableau when we entered the small clearing. 3 tents stood in a semicircle around a long-dead fire pit. A cooking station had been set up on a flat rock with pots and utensils neatly arranged. Backpacks rested against tree trunks and hiking boots were paired outside tent entrances. It looked as though the campers had stepped away momentarily and would return at any second, except they wouldn't. I'd seen enough abandoned sites to recognize the stillness of a place where something had gone wrong. No signs of wildlife disturbance, Melissa noted, crouching to examine the ground. No drag marks. No blood. Tents are all zipped up, called Ryan, one of our newer team members. Sleeping bags inside. Personal items untouched. I moved to the center of the site, turning slowly to take it all in. Check the packs. Look for their phones, emergency equipment. The team methodically went through the campsite, documenting and cataloging. All 7 backpacks were accounted for, containing personal items, extra clothing, and emergency supplies. 6 phones were found powered off in the tents, presumably to conserve battery in an area with little to no service. 1 phone missing, reported Melissa. Based on the personal items, it's probably Jason Mercer's. I nodded, processing this information. So they all left their gear, their shelter, most of their phones, and disappeared without signs of struggle. Looks that way, Melissa agreed. Either they intended to return quickly, or she didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. In our line of work, unfinished scenarios rarely had happy endings. What about those caves Jason mentioned? Asked Pete, who had joined our team for the search. I pulled out my topographical map of the area. Nothing marked within a 3-mile radius, but if they found something new, the dogs might be able to pick up a trail, suggested Carlos, our lead K9 handler. His German Shepherd, Rusty, was already circling the perimeter of the campsite, nose to the ground. Get them working, I agreed. The rest of you continue processing the site. I want to know everything about these people and what might have happened here. For the next hour, we documented every detail of the abandoned campsite while the dog teams worked to establish a scent trail. The scene became increasingly puzzling the more we examined it. Food had been prepared but not eaten. Journal entries stopped mid-sentence. A camera contained photos from the first day and a half of their trip, showing smiling faces against scenic backdrops, but nothing that indicated distress or danger. The last photo showed Jason pointing excitedly toward something off-camera, time-stamped 2:17 p.m. 2 days earlier. The image was slightly blurred, but his expression was clear, a mixture of wonder and surprise. John, Carlos's voice crackled over the radio. Dogs have something. About 200 yards northeast of your position. I keyed my radio. On my way. As I made my way through the dense forest following the sound of excited barking, a sense of unease settled in my stomach. 15 years of search and rescue had given me a sixth sense for when something wasn't right, and something about this case felt fundamentally wrong from the start. Little did I know how deep that wrongness went, or how it would haunt me in the months and years to come, looking for any signs or traces of life. There is no cell service here, so if one were to be injured or lost, it's basically impossible to contact anybody unless you can manage to climb to higher ground. And even then, getting an approximate location is not always guaranteed. We came across this campsite fairly early on in our search, but decided to hold off on exploring it further until we had finished the initial area, scouring the perimeter for any real signs of life. However, after several hours of searching and not finding anyone, our dog seemed to catch a scent trail. Bingo. This was the meal ticket we needed to find these campers. We began following the dogs in the direction they pulled us. About 600 yards down a small hill in the forest, we all got hit with this terrible odor. When I reached Carlos and the dogs, the rest of the team was already converging on the location. Rusty and the other 3 search dogs were all agitated, pulling hard against their leads and whining. Behavior I'd rarely seen from these well-trained animals. What have we got? I asked, slightly winded from jogging through the dense undergrowth. Carlos frowned, restraining Rusty with visible effort. Dogs picked up a strong scent trail heading northeast from the camp. All 4 of them hit on it simultaneously. But, I prompted, sensing his hesitation. But they're acting strange, John, not their usual tracking behavior. More like they're afraid of something. I surveyed the area, seeing nothing immediately unusual, just the same snow-dusted forest that surrounded us for miles. Let's follow it carefully. We formed a line and began tracking the scent trail following the dog's lead. The terrain sloped gradually downward, taking us into a shallow valley I recognized from the topographical maps. According to our charts, this area consisted of loose shale and limestone deposits, not unusual for this part of the park. After about 400 yards, I noticed the first odd detail: a single hiking boot, adult-sized, lying on its side beneath a pine tree. Melissa bagged it as evidence while I photographed its position. Matches the description of the boots the hikers were wearing, she confirmed. Another 100 yards further, we found a flashlight, still switched on but with batteries nearly depleted, its beam barely visible in the daylight. Then a water bottle, a hat, small personal items scattered along an increasingly clear trail through the underbrush, as though the hikers had been shedding possessions as they moved. "It's like a breadcrumb trail," muttered Ryan. "Or like they were in a hurry," Melissa countered, "dropping things as they ran. From what?" Pete asked the question no one wanted to voice. Before anyone could speculate, the wind shifted, and that's when it hit us. A stench so powerful and revolting that several team members immediately gagged or covered their faces. It was death mixed with rotting flesh. It all made us instantaneously nauseous, and judging by the fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the site, it meant that somebody was here. But nobody could survive being out here for this long, not with the storm coming. "What the hell is that?" gasped Ryan, his face pale beneath his winter tan. I'd encountered the smell of death many times in my career, from decomposing bodies lost in the wilderness to animal carcasses rotting in summer heat. This was different, more intense. Wrong somehow? "Masks on," I ordered, pulling my own emergency mask from my pack. It wouldn't completely block the odor, but it might make it bearable enough to continue. The dogs were now in a state of near panic, whining and trying to pull away from the smell rather than toward it. Carlos and the other handlers had to struggle to maintain control. "Should we send the dogs back?" Carlos asked, his voice muffled through his mask. I considered our options. The dogs were our best tracking tool, but their behavior suggested we were approaching something they found deeply threatening. "Secure them here," I decided. "We'll continue on foot. 2 handlers stay with the dogs. 2 come with us." We proceeded more cautiously now, following the trampled path through the snow. The stench grew stronger with each step, becoming almost physically painful in its intensity. Even through the masks, it burned our nostrils and made our eyes water. After going a little further, we could see what appeared to be a large hole in the ground. This is exactly where the dogs were leading us to. We inspected further. The hole was roughly circular, approximately 30 feet in diameter, with edges that appeared to have collapsed inward. Fresh soil and broken limestone were scattered around the perimeter, suggesting this was a recent formation. Standing at the edge, I could see it drop straight down for about 40 feet before opening into what looked like a larger underground space. "This isn't on any of our maps," Pete said, consulting his GPS. "Must be a new sinkhole. Formed within the last week, based on the fresh edges," Melissa added, kneeling to examine the rim. "Probably triggered by those tremors we felt last Tuesday." I shone my high-powered flashlight into the darkness below. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a stone floor littered with debris from the collapse. And something else. Something that made my blood run cold. "Bodies," I said quietly. "I count 5. No, 7 forms down there." The team fell silent, the only sound the whimpering of the dogs in the distance and the whistle of the wind through the trees. "We need to get down there," I said finally. "Melissa, Pete, you're with me. The rest of you, secure a perimeter and set up the retrieval equipment. Radio base camp and update them on our situation." We could tell by approaching this hole that the ground had actually caved in right here, probably from the sheer weight of snow and ice. As we approached this opening and we looked down, we found all 7 hikers. All of them had fallen to their death roughly 40 feet below. But in this weather, as cold as it was, and having them only been missing for the short amount of time, there's still no reason why that horrible odor of death and rotting flesh was as strong as it was, and we can never trace that smell, because the smell was not coming from the small cave in the ground. It was coming from all around us, like we had walked in this thick cloud that enveloped us. We rigged our rappelling gear quickly, with the efficiency that comes from years of practice. Before descending, I radioed the base camp with our coordinates and situation report. The response was broken by static, but they confirmed that additional personnel and body retrieval equipment were being dispatched to our location. Be careful down there, the base camp operator warned. That storm's accelerating. ETA now less than 6 hours. Copy that, I replied. We'll be quick. I went down first, the rope sliding through my gloved hands as I controlled my descent into the darkness. The smell grew even more intense as I dropped into the hole, a miasma that seemed to cling to my clothing and skin. At the bottom, I unclipped from the line and switched on my headlamp to supplement my flashlight. The sight that greeted me confirmed our worst fears. 7 bodies lay scattered across the stone floor, positioned as though they had fallen or been placed there. But something was immediately, disturbingly wrong. There was no blood, no visible trauma consistent with a 40-foot fall. The bodies weren't in the broken, twisted positions I would expect from impact victims. They lay almost peacefully, some on their backs, others curled on their sides as though sleeping. Clear, I called up to Melissa and Pete, who began their own descents. While waiting for them, I conducted an initial assessment, being careful not to disturb the scene more than necessary. The victims wore hiking clothes appropriate for the weather, thermal layers, water-resistant pants, heavy jackets. Their boots were laced, their clothing intact and undamaged. I recognized them from the photos we'd reviewed. Jason, Eliza, the Rodriguez couple, Trevor, Alyssa, and Kyle. The hole opened into a larger chamber roughly 50 feet across, with smooth limestone walls that disappeared into darkness beyond my light's reach. The ground was dry despite the snow above, and surprisingly warm compared to the freezing air at the surface. Melissa reached the bottom and immediately began documenting the scene with her camera. Pete followed moments later, his expression grim behind his mask. "This makes no sense," he said, voice hushed despite the fact that we were the only living souls present. "If the ground collapsed while they were standing on it, they should be more broken," Melissa finished bluntly. "Impact injuries, trauma." I nodded, kneeling beside the nearest body. Alyssa, according to her features, matching the photo we had. No visible injuries consistent with a fall. No defensive wounds. No signs of struggle. "So they were dead before they ended up down here?" Pete suggested. "Or they didn't fall," Melissa countered. "They could have been placed here." "By whom?" Pete asked. "And why wouldn't the same person take their equipment? Their phones? Their valuables?" I moved to examine Jason's body, noting that his right hand was loosely curled around something. Carefully, using a gloved finger, I opened his stiffened fingers. Inside was a phone, presumably the missing device from camp, and a small, smooth stone with odd markings etched into its surface. The phone's screen was cracked, but when I pressed the power button, it flickered to life, showing a battery at 2%. "Got a phone," I announced. "Might give us some answers." As I secured the phone in an evidence bag, Melissa called from the other side of the chamber. "John, you need to see this." I crossed to where she stood, illuminating the wall with her light. Carved or etched into the smooth limestone were symbols, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that reminded me of constellations or circuit diagrams. They seemed to have been there for years, perhaps centuries, the edges worn smooth by time. "What the hell?" Pete whispered, reaching out as if to touch them before thinking better of it. "Carvings like these have been found in other cave systems in the region," Melissa said, "usually attributed to indigenous populations from several thousand years ago." "Usually," I echoed, unconvinced. Something about the symbols seemed wrong, too precise, too mathematical for ancient carvings. As I turned to examine more of the chamber, my light caught something on Alyssa's face that I hadn't noticed before. Moving closer, I directed my beam at her cheek and felt my stomach clench. As these bodies were retrieved, they all had something very disturbing. They all had this strange mark burned into the left side of their cheek. Every single one of them. It was almost like looking at a brand of some kind, like they had been branded. "Check the others," I ordered, my voice sharper than intended. Pete and Melissa moved quickly from body to body, confirming what I already suspected. Each victim bore the same mark, a circular pattern with lines radiating outward like a stylized sun or star. The marks were identical in size and placement, precisely centered on the left cheek of each victim. "What could have done this?" Pete asked, his voice unsteady. "It's a burn," Melissa determined, examining Trevor's mark closely. "Second degree, I'd guess. Clean edges, consistent depth. A brand," I concluded, the word tasting foul in my mouth. They were branded. All of them, identically. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't a group of hikers stumbling into a sinkhole. This was something deliberate, something ritualistic. "We need to get them out of here," I said, my training taking over where rational thought faltered. "Document everything, then prepare for extraction. Let's move." As we worked, I tried to process what we were seeing. The bodies showed no obvious cause of death. No injuries, no signs of violence beyond the brands. They were simply dead. And the smell, that overwhelming stench of decay that seemed to permeate everything, made no sense given the condition of the bodies and the cold temperature, which should have slowed decomposition. It took nearly 2 hours to properly document the scene and prepare the bodies for extraction. By then, additional personnel had arrived at the surface, and we began the grim process of lifting each victim from their underground tomb. As the last body, Daniel Rodriguez, was secured and began its ascent, I made a final sweep of the chamber, ensuring we hadn't missed anything. My light caught a dark opening in the far wall, a passage leading deeper into the earth. Curiosity and professional thoroughness compelled me to investigate. The tunnel was narrow but navigable, descending at a gentle slope. After about 20 feet, it opened into another smaller chamber. My light revealed more symbols carved into these walls, similar to those in the main chamber but arranged differently. And in the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, roughly waist-high, with a shallow depression carved into its top. The depression was empty, but a fine dust or residue lined it, glinting slightly in my light. I photographed it carefully from multiple angles, then took a sample using an evidence bag from my kit. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye, a small object half buried in the dirt floor. I crouched and carefully excavated it. A metal cylinder, approximately 6 inches long and half an inch in diameter. It was surprisingly heavy for its size and had no visible seams or markings. I bagged this as well, then made my way back to the main chamber. Melissa was waiting for me at the bottom of the rope. "Find something?" she asked, noting the additional evidence bags. "Maybe," I replied. "There's another chamber back there. More symbols. And this." I showed her the metal cylinder. She frowned, examining it through the clear plastic. "Doesn't look like any camping gear I've seen." "Me neither. Let's get it to the lab." We were the last to ascend, emerging into a world transformed. The wind had picked up significantly during our time underground, driving needle-sharp snowflakes horizontally through the air. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees and dark clouds boiled overhead. "Storm's coming in fast," Pete greeted us, shouting to be heard over the wind. "We need to move." The bodies had been secured in evacuation bags and were being prepared for transport. Given the deteriorating conditions, we would be using helicopter extraction rather than trying to carry them overland back to the trailhead. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. Daylight was already fading, and the storm would make visibility worse. The extraction point was a meadow about a mile southeast of our position, the closest suitable landing zone for the helicopters. "Move out," I ordered, and our grim procession began to make its way through the increasingly hostile forest. The journey that should have taken 30 minutes stretched to over an hour as conditions worsened. By the time we reached the meadow, visibility had dropped to less than 50 feet, and the howling wind threatened to knock us off our feet. The meadow itself was barely recognizable, already covered in several inches of fresh snow whipped into drifts by the gale. I radioed the approaching helicopters, who confirmed they could still attempt the extraction but warned it would be their last window before the storm made flying impossible. The next 40 minutes were a blur of activity as the helicopters arrived one after another, hovering just long enough to load the bodies and essential personnel before fighting their way back into the turbulent sky. The last chopper would take Melissa, Pete, and me, along with the evidence we'd collected. As we waited for its return, huddled against the driving snow, Pete voiced the question that had been hanging between us unspoken. "What happened to those people, John?" I had no answer that made any sense. After 15 years of search and rescue, I'd seen death in almost every form the wilderness could deliver. Exposure, falls, animal attacks, drowning, but nothing like this. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we'll find out." The distant thump of rotor blades announced our ride's approach, barely audible over the screaming wind. As we prepared to board, I took one last look back toward the forest that concealed the sinkhole. Through the curtain of snow, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the tree line, tall, unnaturally still, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone, if it had ever been there at all. Just another trick of the storm in my overtaxed mind. But as the helicopter lifted us away from that cursed meadow, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being allowed to leave, that whatever had claimed those 7 lives had decided, for now, that it didn't want ours. And upon further inspection of their corpses, neither of them had actually died from impact of falling. In fact, the medical examiner could not find a sign of death. It's as if they had just dropped dead. There was no outward physical signs of death or damage to the body. No fractured bones, no torn flesh, but yet none of it made sense. Somehow there was this cave in the ground that spanned roughly 30 feet in diameter and dropped to about 40 feet below in a rocky alcove. And past the alcove it dropped even deeper, so deep you could not even see because it was dark. Why were they all down here together? Did somebody dump them down here? That's how it was starting to look. The helicopter ride back to Blackwood Memorial Hospital was turbulent and tense. Melissa sat beside me, reviewing the photos on her camera, while Pete stared silently out the window at the storm-lashed landscape below. None of us spoke. The roar of the engines made conversation difficult. But more than that, I think we were all processing what we'd seen, trying to fit it into frameworks that made sense and finding no way to do so. I clutched the evidence bags containing the phone, the strange stone, the metal cylinder, and the residue sample from the pedestal. Whatever answers existed, I hoped they might be found in these items. We landed at the hospital helipad at 6:23 p.m., by which time the storm had engulfed the entire region. The medical examiner, Dr. Eleanor Patel, met us as we disembarked, her face grave beneath the hood of her parka. "The bodies?" she asked without preamble. "Already inside," I confirmed. "All 7. She nodded once. "I've cleared my schedule. We start immediately." "I want to observe," I told her, not a request, but a statement. Her eyes met mine, and I saw understanding there. Like me, Dr. Patel had spent her career in this remote county, dealing with the unique challenges it presented. "We'd worked together on countless cases over the years, of course," she said. "But clean up first. You smell like—" She didn't finish, but she didn't need to. Despite our decontamination procedures before boarding the helicopter, the stench from the sinkhole still clung to us, to our clothes, our gear, our skin. After showering and changing into clean clothes from my emergency locker, I made my way to the morgue in the hospital's basement level. Melissa had volunteered to log our evidence with the county sheriff's department, and Pete had returned to the Park Service offices to file his initial report. The morgue was brightly lit and clinically cold, stainless steel and tile designed for functionality rather than comfort. Dr. Patel was already at work, her assistant helping her arrange the 7 bodies on examination tables. "John," she greeted me, looking up from her preliminary notes. "Ready to begin?" I nodded, taking a position where I could observe without interfering. Dr. Patel was methodical and thorough, starting with external examinations of each victim. She documented the strange brand marks in particular detail, photographing and measuring each one. "These were inflicted ante-mortem," she noted, examining Jason Mercer's cheek under magnification. "There's vital reaction in the surrounding tissue. I'd estimate they were made between 12 and 24 hours before death." "They're identical," I observed. "Placement, size, pattern." "Yes," she agreed. "Remarkably consistent." This wasn't done by hand. Some kind of tool or device was used, something that could maintain perfect precision across multiple applications. As the examination continued, Dr. Patel's frown deepened. Each body told the same puzzling story. No external trauma beyond the brands, no signs of struggle, no indications of environmental exposure, despite being found in a subterranean chamber. "Let's move to internal examination," she decided, preparing her instruments for the first autopsy. I won't detail the procedures that followed. I've witnessed many autopsies in my career, but these were different. Increasingly frustrating as Dr. Patel found nothing that explained how these 7 healthy adults had died. No water in the lungs to suggest drowning. No signs of cardiac failure. No evidence of toxins, though blood samples would be sent for detailed screening. Brain and organ tissues appeared normal. No internal bleeding or trauma. It was as if they had simply stopped living. "This makes no sense," Dr. Patel muttered 4 hours into the examination. She had just completed the autopsy on Trevor Winters, the 5th victim, with the same lack of findings. Healthy adults don't just die without cause. I had been thinking the same thing, growing more uneasy with each inconclusive result. But as she prepared to examine Alyssa Newman, something caught my attention. "Wait," I said, moving closer. "What's that on her arm?" Dr. Patel followed my gaze to a small, almost imperceptible mark on Alyssa's inner forearm. A tiny red dot, like an injection site. "Good catch," she said, adjusting her light to examine it better. "Definitely a puncture wound, recent." She checked the other arm and found nothing, then methodically examined the rest of the body. No other punctures were visible. "Check the others," I suggested. Returning to the bodies she'd already examined, Dr. Patel found similar marks on each one, a single puncture wound on the inner forearm, so small it had been easy to overlook. "Injection sites," she confirmed, "all in the same location, like the brands, too precise to be coincidental." This discovery led her to modify her approach for the final 2 autopsies. When she reached Kyle Braddock, the last victim, she spent extra time examining the puncture site on his arm, taking multiple tissue samples from the area. "There's something here," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "A foreign object under the skin." Using careful dissection, she exposed what appeared to be a thin metal rod embedded in the subcutaneous tissue of Kyle's forearm, aligned with the puncture mark on the skin. Now, what I'm about to tell you kind of makes things more disturbing. One of the males of the group apparently had a long metal rod stuck into his forearm, and I don't mean when he fell. The coroner noticed something underneath the skin. Upon cutting it out, it was this long, strange, round piece of maybe roughly no more than 8 inches in length total, right in his forearm. It resembled the cylinder I'd found in the underground chamber, but smaller, perhaps 3 inches long and extremely thin, like a slender needle. Dr. Patel extracted it carefully and placed it in a specimen container. "I need to check the others again," she said, returning to the previously examined bodies with renewed purpose. One by one, she located similar objects in each victim, all in the same position in the left forearm, all the same size and apparent composition. 7 metal rods from 7 bodies, what are they? I asked, staring at the lined-up specimen containers. "I've never seen anything like them," Dr. Patel admitted. "They appear to be metal, but..." She picked up one container, tilting it under the light. "The texture is unusual. I'll need to run tests." When doing a further analysis on this piece of metal, it also turned out to be no known type of metal that we have here on Earth. For as small as it was, in girth and size it was incredibly strong. It would not bend. It was in no way malleable and emitted static electricity at times. As Dr. Patel prepared the mysterious objects for analysis, I used the morgue phone to call Melissa. "Find anything on the evidence?" I asked when she answered. "The phone's battery died completely before we could extract any data," she reported. "Tech team is working on it now. The stone has those same symbols we saw in the cave. And the metal cylinder?" She paused. "John, it's not reading as any known metal on our preliminary tests." The lab's fascinated. I glanced at the specimen containers holding the rods from the victim's arms. "We found something else. Similar objects embedded in each victim's arm. Dr. Patel is about to run tests on them." "Jesus," Melissa breathed. "What the hell happened out there?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it's bigger than a hiking accident. Get the sheriff involved. We need a full investigation." After hanging up, I rejoined Dr. Patel, who was preparing to run initial tests on one of the metal rods. She placed it on a small scale, then frowned at the readout. "That can't be right," she muttered, recalibrating the instrument and trying again. Same result. "This thing weighs almost nothing, less than a gram." Yet when she attempted to bend or break it using forceps, the rod remained perfectly rigid. Even more strangely, when she placed it near the electronic equipment, the displays flickered momentarily. "It's affecting the electrical systems," she noted, quickly moving it away. Some kind of interference. Further tests yielded equally perplexing results. The rod couldn't be scratched or marred by a scalpel. It maintained a constant temperature regardless of environmental conditions, and most disturbingly, when placed under certain light wavelengths, it seemed to emit a faint glow of its own. "I need more specialized equipment for this," Dr. Patel finally admitted, "and expertise beyond what I have. This isn't like any material I've encountered." By the time we finished, it was past midnight. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows of the morgue with its fury. Dr. Patel had compiled her preliminary findings, or lack thereof, and secured the bodies and mysterious objects for further examination. "The brands," I said as we prepared to leave. "Did you recognize the pattern?" She shook her head. "Nothing I've seen before. It resembles some astronomical symbols, perhaps, or mathematical notation, but it's not from any medical or scientific context I know." I nodded, unsurprised. Nothing about this case aligned with established patterns or explanations. "I'll have more after the toxicology reports," she promised, "and once we get the specialized analysis on those objects." I thanked her for her thoroughness and headed upstairs to find Sheriff Dalton waiting for me in the hospital lobby. Miles Dalton was a 20-year veteran of law enforcement. With the weathered face and cautious eyes that came with the job in a place like Blackwood County. "Heard you found something unusual up there," he said by way of greeting. I almost laughed at the understatement. "You could say that." Melissa briefed me on the basics. 7 dead, no obvious cause. Strange marks, metal objects. He gestured toward the cafeteria. "Buy you a coffee? Sounds like we have a lot to discuss." Over bitter hospital coffee, I detailed everything we'd found, from the abandoned campsite to the sinkhole to the baffling autopsy results. Dalton listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "So we're looking at what?" he asked when I'd finished. "Murder? Some kind of cult activity?" "I don't know," I admitted. "The brands suggest ritual. The embedded objects suggest something else." I hesitated, reluctant to voice the thoughts that had been forming in my mind. "It doesn't fit any pattern I recognize." Dalton nodded slowly. "I'll open a formal investigation. First thing tomorrow, I'll send deputies to secure the scene. Though with this storm, they might not be able to reach it immediately." "There's something else," I said, lowering my voice despite the empty cafeteria. That smell at the site. It was wrong. Too strong, too. Pervasive for bodies that had been dead only a day or two in freezing temperatures. Could have been an animal carcass nearby, Dalton suggested. "Bear, maybe. Or multiple smaller animals?" "Maybe," I agreed, not believing it. "But we found nothing else." "Well, whatever happened, we'll figure it out," Dalton said with more confidence than I felt. "We always do." But as I drove home through the howling storm at 2 a.m., I wasn't so sure. This felt different from anything we'd encountered before. The strange symbols, the inexplicable deaths, the alien objects embedded in human flesh. It all pointed to something beyond our usual framework of understanding. And that smell, that horrible, all-encompassing stench of death that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere, continued to haunt me, clinging to my memory as it had clung to my clothes. Caroline was asleep when I arrived home, having left a note on the kitchen counter. "Found them?" I wrote a simple yes beneath it, unable to explain more on paper, unsure if I could explain it at all. As I showered again, trying to wash away the lingering psychological residue of the day, I found myself staring at my own forearm, half expecting to see a telltale puncture mark appearing on my skin. These things about the body are things that I did not myself see personally, but things I was told through friends in the coroner himself. A huge investigation was conducted, by not just on these hikers but the entire surrounding area, and nothing could be found. No trace of these hikers' disappearances, no trace of their deaths or murder, no trace of a murderer, and no trace of this putrid death smell that still lingered in the area once these bodies were long gone. In fact, the smell only seemed to extend and reach further out, lasting up to 4 weeks after this happened, before just one day suddenly disappeared. The storm raged for 3 days, dropping over 4 feet of snow on Blackwood National Park and the surrounding county. Roads were impassable, power lines down, and communications spotty at best. I spent the time compiling my official report, though I found myself struggling with how to document aspects of the case that defied conventional explanation. When the weather finally cleared enough for emergency vehicles to move freely, Sheriff Dalton assembled a task force to investigate the deaths. I was included as the SAR coordinator, along with Melissa, Dr. Patel, 2 county detectives, a forensic specialist, and a representative from the FBI field office in the state capitol. Our first meeting took place at the Sheriff's Department, a windowless conference room filled with maps, photographs, and preliminary reports. Agent Rebecca Larson from the FBI sat quietly in the corner, observing more than participating as Sheriff Dalton outlined what we knew. 7 victims, identified as Jason Mercer, Eliza Carpenter, Daniel and Sophia Rodriguez, Trevor Winters, Alyssa Newman, and Kyle Braddock, found in an unmapped sinkhole approximately 7 miles from the east entrance of Blackwood National Park. He pointed to the location on the topographical map pinned to the wall. No obvious cause of death, Dr. Patel continued. Toxicology reports came back negative for common substances. No environmental causes like carbon monoxide or methane exposure. No signs of violence or struggle beyond the identical brand marks found on each victim's left cheek. She displayed photographs of the brands, clinical, close-up images that somehow looked more disturbing in the harsh fluorescent light of the conference room than they had in the morgue. And these objects? Agent Larson spoke for the first time, gesturing to the images of the metal rods. Still being analyzed, Dr. Patel replied. Initial tests are inconclusive. They appear to be some kind of metal alloy, but it doesn't match any known composition in our databases. What about the markings in the cave? Detective Harding asked. Any progress identifying those? Melissa took this question. We've consulted with anthropologists and archaeologists from the State University. They confirm similar symbols have been found in other cave systems in the region, but there's disagreement about their origin and meaning. Some attribute them to indigenous populations from 3,000, 5,000 years ago. Others suggest they may be more recent. And the stone found in the victim's hand? Sheriff Dalton prompted. Same symbols, Melissa confirmed. Lab confirms it's local limestone, likely from the cave itself. What about the phone? I asked. Any data recovered? Detective Harding nodded. Tech team managed to extract the contents. Last text message was sent 3 days before the bodies were discovered, matching what we already knew. But there was something else. A video recorded approximately 12 hours before estimated time of death. He moved to the laptop connected to the room's projector and pulled up a file. Warning, this is disturbing. The video began playing on the wall screen. It showed a shaky handheld shot of what appeared to be the inside of a tent, illuminated by a flashlight. Jason Mercer's voice came through, breathless and excited. Day 3 at Blackwood. We found something incredible yesterday. Some kind of underground chamber that's not on any of the park maps. Eliza thinks it might be part of the limestone cave system that runs through this region. But if so, it's completely unmapped. The camera turned to show Eliza, who was examining something small in her hands. The stone with the strange symbols. These markings are everywhere down there, Jason continued, panning to show similar stones they had apparently collected. We're going back today for a more thorough exploration. Trevor rigged up some proper climbing gear so we can descend safely. The video cut abruptly, then resumed showing what was clearly the interior of the cave we had found. The 7 hikers were visible, their headlamps creating crisscrossing beams in the darkness. They looked excited, not afraid. This chamber extends further than we thought, Jason's voice narrated as he panned around. There's some kind of tunnel system beyond that narrow passage. We're going to check it out. The camera followed as the group moved through the tunnel I had discovered during our recovery operation, emerging into the smaller chamber with the pedestal. Look at this, Alyssa called, her voice echoing slightly. Some kind of altar? The camera zoomed in on the pedestal, showing that the depression on top contained what appeared to be a metallic object. The cylinder I had found half buried in the dirt. Don't touch it, Daniel cautioned. But Trevor was already reaching for it. It's warm, Trevor said, surprise evident in his voice as he lifted the cylinder. And light, like it's hollow. As he held it up, the cylinder seemed to catch the light strangely, reflecting it in patterns that matched the symbols on the walls. For a brief moment, the camera captured all 7 hikers standing around the pedestal, their faces illuminated by this unusual reflection. Then the video abruptly cut to static for several seconds before resuming with a much darker, shakier shot. Jason appeared to be running, his breathing heavy and panicked. The camera caught glimpses of trees, snow, darkness. Something's following us, he gasped, ever since we left the cave. We can't see it, but it's there. The others. He broke off, turning the camera to show the other 6 hikers stumbling through the forest behind him. They all looked disoriented, confused. We need to go back, Eliza was saying, her voice oddly flat. We need to return it. No, Jason responded. Something's wrong. Something's happening to all of you. We need to get help. The camera swung wildly as Jason apparently stumbled, then steadied on a shot of the night sky between tree branches. A strange light moved across the frame. Not the moon, not an aircraft, but something that seemed to pulse and shift in ways that defied normal movement patterns. Jason's voice came again, now a whisper. What is that? What is... The video ended abruptly. Silence filled the conference room as the screen went dark. No one spoke for several long moments. What the hell did we just watch? Detective Harding finally asked. Clearly they found something in that cave, Sheriff Dalton said, his voice carefully neutral. Something that may have led to their deaths. The timestamp on this video places it at approximately 11:30 p.m., 2 nights before we found the bodies, Detective Harding noted. Their estimated time of death is around noon the following day, according to Dr. Patel's assessment. So they survived the night after this recording, I said, trying to construct a timeline. But something happened the next day. We need to get back to that site, Sheriff Dalton decided. Full forensic team. Document everything in that cave system. The weather's still difficult up there, I cautioned, but passable with proper equipment. I'll coordinate with our evidence response team, Agent Larson said, speaking up again. This falls within federal jurisdiction as it occurred in a national park. Planning for the site investigation took another day, during which additional analyses were conducted on the metal rods extracted from the victims. Dr. Patel forwarded the preliminary results to our task force via email. The objects removed from the victims' forearms defy conventional material analysis. They are composed of an unidentified metallic alloy that exhibits several anomalous properties. Extreme lightweight yet exceptional structural integrity. 2. Resistance to all attempted deformation or damage. 3. Slight electromagnetic emission. 4. No radioactivity detected, but unusual energy signature present. I've sent samples to the FBI laboratory for more advanced testing. In my 22 years of forensic pathology, I have never encountered any material with these properties. The return expedition to the sinkhole was scheduled for the following day. Our team consisted of Sheriff Dalton, Detective Harding, Agent Larson, Melissa, myself, and 4 FBI evidence specialists. The journey was arduous, with deep snow and fallen trees blocking much of the trail, but we reached the site by early afternoon. The sinkhole remained as we had left it, the edges now crusted with ice and snow. But something had changed. The smell, that horrible stench of decay that had nearly overwhelmed us during the recovery operation, was stronger than before. What is that? Agent Larson asked, grimacing behind her mask. That's what we've been trying to figure out, I replied. It was present when we found the bodies, but it's intensified since then. Despite the bodies being removed, Melissa added. And despite the freezing temperatures which should suppress decomposition odors, we set up a pulley system and began our descent into the sinkhole. The main chamber appeared unchanged, though our powerful lights revealed details I had missed during the recovery operation. Additional symbols carved into the higher portions of the walls, and what looked like a fine, dark residue on the stone floor. Take samples of everything, Agent Larson instructed her team. Every surface, every substance. We proceeded to the smaller chamber with the pedestal, which I had only briefly examined during our previous visit. In daylight, filtered down through the sinkhole entrance, the space revealed new details. The symbols on the walls were arranged in concentric circles, radiating outward from the pedestal at the center. These aren't random, Detective Harding observed, photographing the patterns. There's a deliberate design here. Look at this, called one of the evidence technicians who had been examining the pedestal. There's some kind of mechanism built into it. Upon closer inspection, the seemingly solid stone pedestal contained a series of moving parts, rings that could be rotated to align different symbols, similar to a combination lock. The depression on top, where the metal cylinder had been found, appeared to be just one component of a more complex structure. This isn't ancient indigenous art, Melissa said, her voice hushed with realization. This is technology. As the evidence team continued their documentation and collection, Sheriff Dalton, Agent Larson, and I explored further, discovering that the tunnel system extended deeper than I had initially realized. Beyond the pedestal chamber, a narrow passage descended at a steep angle, eventually opening into a much larger cavern. This space was different, clearly natural rather than constructed, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and a small underground stream running along one wall. But even here, the strange symbols appeared, carved into the natural rock formations in patterns that seemed to follow the water's flow. How far does this go? Sheriff Dalton wondered, his voice echoing in the vast space. Unknown, Agent Larson replied, consulting a handheld device. But we're already nearly 200 feet below the surface. We decided not to proceed further without proper caving equipment and additional personnel. As we made our way back to the main chamber, I noticed something that had escaped my attention before. Small, almost imperceptible holes drilled into the walls at regular intervals, each about the diameter of a pencil. These weren't made by natural processes, I pointed out to Agent Larson. They're too precise, too uniform. She examined one closely with a penlight. They appear to form some kind of grid pattern throughout the chamber. Almost like sensors, I finished, the realization dawning, or emitters. By the time we completed our investigation and returned to the surface, night was falling. The evidence team had collected dozens of samples and hundreds of photographs. Agent Larson had been in regular communication with her superiors, her expression growing increasingly grave with each conversation. As we prepared to depart, she pulled me aside. Mitchell, what we found down there, it doesn't align with any known cultural artifacts or natural formations. My office is classifying this investigation effective immediately. Classifying? I echoed, disbelieving. These are 7 dead civilians. Their families deserve answers. And they'll get them, she assured me, though her tone lacked conviction, but through proper channels after we've determined exactly what we're dealing with here. I wanted to argue further, but was interrupted by a call from Melissa, who had been monitoring the perimeter of the site. John, you need to see this. I followed her voice to the edge of the clearing, where she stood staring at the snow-covered ground. In the fading daylight, I could see what had alarmed her, a set of tracks leading away from the sinkhole into the dense forest. But they weren't human tracks. They weren't animal tracks either, at least not from any species I recognized. The impressions were oddly shaped with 3 pointed extensions like toes, but larger than any known predator in the region. And they appeared to have been made recently, the edges still sharp in the crusty snow. What made these? Sheriff Dalton asked, crouching to examine them. No one had an answer. As we followed the tracks to the tree line, they simply stopped, not gradually fading, but ending abruptly as though whatever had made them had suddenly vanished or been lifted away. Keep in mind, this place is covered in at least 2 to 3 feet of snow. Temperatures are often dropping down at 10 degrees at night, and yet this rotting flesh, putrid death smell was as pungent as ever. It was like being trapped in the back of a van or so with dead, rotting animals in the summertime in 100-degree heat. The odor was that strong. Our return to Blackwood was subdued, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we had discovered. The next morning, I arrived at the sheriff's office to find an unfamiliar black SUV parked outside, and 2 men in dark suits speaking with Sheriff Dalton in his private office. Melissa intercepted me in the hallway. "Something's happening," she said in a low voice. "Agent Larson has been recalled to Washington. These new guys arrived an hour ago. They're not FBI. They won't say which agency they're with." Before I could respond, Sheriff Dalton's door opened and he beckoned me inside. The 2 men regarded me with polite but evaluating expressions. "John Mitchell," one of them said, not offering his hand. "I understand you led the recovery operation at the Blackwood sinkhole." "That's right," I confirmed, looking to Sheriff Dalton for explanation. "These gentlemen are from a federal task force," Dalton said, his expression carefully neutral. "They're taking over the investigation." "What task force?" I asked. "This is a local matter, 7 dead hikers. It's a matter of national security now," the second man interrupted smoothly. "We'll need all your reports, all evidence collected, and detailed statements from everyone involved in the recovery and subsequent investigation. Over the next 2 days, I was interviewed extensively about every aspect of the case, as were Melissa, Dr. Patel, and everyone else connected to it. The strange metal objects, the stone with symbols, the samples from the cave, all were confiscated and transported to an undisclosed location. A week after their arrival, the men departed as suddenly as they had appeared. Sheriff Dalton called me into his office again, his expression troubled. "The case is closed, John," he said without preamble. "Closed?" I echoed in disbelief. "How can it be closed? We don't even know what happened to those people." "Official cause of death has been determined as environmental exposure and accidental fall," he replied, not meeting my eyes. "The families have been notified. The bodies are being released for burial." "That's bullshit, Miles, and you know it," I said, anger rising. "Those people didn't die from exposure or a fall. What about the brands? The metal objects in their arms? The video? Dalton sighed heavily. There is no video, John. There are no metal objects. The marks on their faces have been attributed to contact with mineral deposits in the cave. The case is closed. I stared at him, unable to process what I was hearing. They're covering it up. Why? I don't know, he admitted quietly. But I do know that pushing this further will cost us our jobs at minimum. Maybe worse. Whatever those hikers found, someone very powerful wants it kept quiet. I left his office in a daze, unable to reconcile the official conclusion with what I had seen with my own eyes. That night I returned home to find Caroline waiting for me, concern etched on her face. Someone came by the house today, she said. 2 men in suits. They asked about your involvement in the Blackwood case. They were insistent. A chill ran through me. What did you tell them? Only what you've told me, which isn't much, she replied. John, what's going on? What did you find out there? I looked at my wife of 12 years, the person I trusted most in the world, and found myself unable to answer truthfully. Not because I didn't trust her, but because I couldn't make sense of it myself, and because I was afraid of what knowing might mean for her. It's over, I said instead. Case closed. Accidental deaths. She knew I was withholding something but didn't press. Instead, she asked, Are you in danger? No, I answered, hoping it was true. But I think it's best if I don't discuss the details. Even with you, for now. In the days that followed, life gradually returned to normal. The strange deaths at Blackwood became local legend, whispered about but officially explained away. The sinkhole was filled in, the area declared hazardous and off-limits due to geological instability. And yet, for weeks afterward, hikers and park rangers reported the same horrible smell permeating the forest around the former site, a stench of decay that seemed to grow stronger rather than dissipate with time. Then, exactly 4 weeks after we had discovered the bodies, the smell vanished, not gradually fading but disappearing completely overnight, as though it had never existed at all. While I can only myself speculate on all the things it could be, I could tell you what it definitely is not. I do not believe that these hikers were murdered in any way. I believe that after everything I know, something else much darker happened to them. Were they abducted? I don't know. I can't say that. But something took them from their campsite, 650 meters up from this spot, and placed them down in this hole in the earth, 40 feet down, where they were all dead. 3 months passed. Spring came to Blackwood County, melting the deep snowdrifts and bringing new life to the forests. On the surface, everything had returned to normal. I continued my work with search and rescue, responding to the usual calls, lost hikers, injured climbers, the occasional stranded motorist. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, I remained haunted by what we had found in that sinkhole. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by nightmares of dark chambers and strange symbols. I found myself obsessively researching obscure archaeological findings, unexplained disappearances in national parks, and scientific anomalies. Caroline noticed, of course. How could she not? But she respected my silence on the matter, supporting me in other ways, making sure I ate properly, encouraging me to spend time outdoors when I wasn't working, gently steering conversations away from anything related to Blackwood National Park when others brought it up. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, hand-delivered to our mailbox without postage or return address. My name was written on the envelope in neat, precise handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing an address in the neighboring county and a date and time, Thursday, 8 p.m. Nothing else. No signature, no explanation. I should have reported it to Sheriff Dalton. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I tucked it into my pocket and told no one. Thursday evening found me driving alone to the specified address, which turned out to be a small roadside diner about 40 miles from Blackwood. The place was nearly empty when I arrived. Just an elderly couple in one booth and a solitary figure in the farthest corner, face obscured by a newspaper. I ordered coffee from the disinterested waitress and waited, unsure what to expect. After a few minutes, the newspaper lowered, revealing a face I recognized immediately, Dr. Eleanor Patel. She gestured for me to join her, which I did, sliding into the booth across from her. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you would." "Why all the secrecy?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Because what I'm about to tell you could cost us both more than our jobs, she replied. Her usually composed face showed signs of the same strain I'd been feeling. Dark circles under her eyes, new lines around her mouth. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small, sealed container, which she placed on the table between us. Through the clear plastic, I could see a familiar metallic object, one of the rods we had extracted from the hiker's arms. How did you? I began. I kept one, she interrupted, before they confiscated everything. I couldn't just let it go, not without answers. I stared at the object, feeling a mixture of dread and vindication. So they do exist. The official report is a lie, she finished. A fabrication. Those hikers didn't die from exposure or a fall. They didn't even die from anything I can identify in my extensive medical career. She leaned forward. I've spent the last 3 months analyzing this thing in private, using equipment borrowed from colleagues under false pretenses. And John, it's not from here. The park? I asked, though I already suspected what she meant. Earth, she clarified. The metallurgical composition includes elements that don't exist on the periodic table. The internal structure defies known physics, and it emits a frequency that can't be detected by standard equipment. I only found it by accident using an experimental scanner developed by a friend at the university. I felt cold despite the diner's warmth. What are you saying exactly? I'm saying that whatever those hikers encountered in that cave wasn't human technology. It wasn't ancient indigenous artifacts. It was something else entirely. We sat in silence for a moment, the implications hanging between us. There's more, Dr. Patel continued eventually. I managed to access some of the brain tissue samples I took from the victims before they were confiscated. They showed cellular changes I've never seen before, neural pathways altered in ways that shouldn't be possible without major physical trauma, yet there was no such trauma present. What kind of alterations? I asked. It's as if their brains were rewired somehow. Specific regions related to perception, memory, and consciousness showed microscopic changes consistent with some kind of targeted modification. By the objects in their arms? She nodded. That would be my hypothesis. The metal rods seemed designed to interface with the human nervous system. They were positioned precisely along major nerve pathways in the forearm that connect directly to the brain. My mind flashed back to the video we had seen, the hiker's strange behavior after discovering the metal cylinder in the cave. Eliza's flat voice saying they needed to return it. They were being controlled, I said, the realization crystallizing. Something was influencing them through these devices. Or communicating with them, Dr. Patel suggested. Or studying them. We can only speculate on the purpose. What about the brands? The symbols? I believe they're connected to the frequency these devices emit. Possibly some kind of marking system. Identification, perhaps. I took a sip of my now cold coffee, trying to process everything. Why are you telling me this now? Why the secrecy? Dr. Patel's expression darkened. Because 2 weeks ago I received a visit from the same men who took over our investigation. They knew I had kept a sample. They threatened my career, my family. She paused. And then they offered me a job studying similar materials at a classified facility. What did you tell them? I said I needed time to consider. But the truth is, I'm afraid, John. Not just of them, but of what this means. If these objects are what I think they are, then something non-human is operating in our backyard. Something with technology far beyond our understanding. Something that can kill without leaving a trace. And the government knows, I added. They're covering it up, she nodded. Which means it's happened before. The question is how many times? And why Blackwood? We talked for another hour, sharing theories and observations that we'd both been afraid to voice to anyone else. Dr. Patel had done extensive research into similar cases across the country, hikers and campers found dead under mysterious circumstances, often in remote wilderness areas, often without clear cause of death. There's a pattern, she explained. Most incidents occur in or near national parks. Most involve groups rather than individuals, and most have some geographical feature in common. Caves, sinkholes, unusual rock formations. Like the cave system under Blackwood, I noted. Exactly. I think these entities, whatever they are, have been here a long time. The symbols we found may have been warnings left by indigenous peoples who encountered them centuries ago. As our conversation wound down, Dr. Patel carefully returned the metal rod to her bag. I'm leaving town tomorrow, I've accepted a position at a hospital in Arizona, as far from Blackwood as I could manage. You're running, I observed, not judgmentally. Yes, she admitted without shame. I have children, John. I can't risk their safety by pursuing this further. But I couldn't leave without telling someone else what I'd learned. Someone who saw what I saw. What should I do with this information? I asked. She considered the question carefully. That's for you to decide. But be careful. These people, whoever they are, they're watching. They've invested considerable resources in keeping this quiet. We parted ways in the parking lot, Dr. Patel heading west while I returned home, my mind spinning with revelations and questions. I told Caroline I'd been working late, hating the lie but unable to burden her with the truth. That night I made a decision. I wouldn't run like Dr. Patel, but I wouldn't recklessly pursue the truth either. I would watch, wait, and document. If something was happening in Blackwood, something beyond human understanding, then evidence would eventually surface again. And when it did, I would be ready. In the months that followed, I compiled a private record of everything related to the case, my memories, observations, conversations with Dr. Patel, and research into similar incidents across the country. I kept this record secure, separate from my home and work, telling no one of its existence. Life continued. Seasons changed. Blackwood National Park received its usual flow of visitors, none aware of what had happened in that remote section now marked as closed due to environmental hazards. Oh, and I should also mention that their time of death all seemed to be about the same time. What everything pointed to was that they were somehow taken or they disappeared. They were branded. Judging by the evidence, I'm assuming they were all killed somehow and placed together in this hole in the earth. A year after finding those 7 bodies, I was called to a new search and rescue operation. 3 hikers missing in the western quadrant of the park, an area miles from the previous incident. We found their campsite undisturbed, equipment intact, no signs of struggle or wildlife interference. And as we expanded our search perimeter, the dogs began behaving strangely, pulling toward an area not marked on our maps, an area where a familiar putrid smell hung in the still forest air. History, it seemed, was repeating itself. But this time I knew what we might be dealing with. This time I was prepared to document everything, to preserve evidence before it could be confiscated or explained away. Because whatever was happening in Blackwood National Park, whatever had killed those 7 hikers and branded them with alien symbols and implanted foreign objects in their flesh, it wasn't finished. It was just waiting, watching, perhaps learning from each encounter. It's stories like these that really rattle your brain at night, because a lot of times you'll have very normal search and rescue missions. People disappear, you find them, everything is okay, or you don't find them and everything is not okay. But oftentimes, search and rescue missions happen where you don't find or do find somebody, and there are some very disturbing attributes to their entire disappearance. I don't know what we're dealing with in those woods. I don't know if it's something that evolved alongside us, undetected for centuries, or something that came from elsewhere. I don't know if the government is actively collaborating with it or merely covering up its existence to prevent panic. What I do know is this: 7 people died in Blackwood National Park after encountering something beyond human understanding. Their deaths were covered up by forces with the power to rewrite reality on paper, to make evidence disappear, to threaten and coerce those who knew the truth. And it will happen again. Perhaps in Blackwood, perhaps elsewhere. The patterns are there if you know how to look for them. The missing hikers, the inexplicable deaths, the strange phenomena reported briefly before being dismissed or rationalized away. So I continue my work with search and rescue, helping those I can, and watching for signs of something beyond our comprehension operating in the wilderness we falsely believe we've tamed. I maintain my records, adding to them whenever I find new information or connections. And I wonder sometimes if I'm being watched in return, if the strange metal devices that killed those hikers might one day find their way under my own skin, sending signals to whatever intelligence designed them. In the dark of night, when sleep eludes me, I sometimes find myself touching my left cheek, half expecting to feel the raised pattern of a brand I cannot see, and I listen for sounds that shouldn't exist, smell for odors that have no natural source, and wait for the day when the truth can no longer be buried in a filled-in sinkhole in the remote wilderness of Blackwood National Park. Or when I look in the mirror, I'll see the mark on my own face and know that I'm already part of whatever happened to those 7 hikers. That I have been, perhaps, since the moment I descended into that hole in the earth and breathed in the inexplicable stench of death that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Look, I'll be honest with you. I wish I myself had more answers, and clearly I don't. That's kind of why I'm sharing this story with you, in hopes that maybe you can kind of bounce me back some speculations and maybe some theories about what you think could have happened. I know you're not necessarily a guru, but surely you've read enough and researched enough that there has to be some sort of explanation. I mean, I don't know what else to think. If my mind goes the whole alien UFO route, I feel crazy. But if my mind goes the route of a murderer, or some sort of occultic rituals, I think of the logistics and the practicality of how all this took place, and how none of this makes sense or even seems probable. The truth is out there in those woods, buried beneath layers of official denial and classification, and one day I intend to find it before it finds me. I've always known the forest held secrets. As a park ranger at Cherokee National Forest for 15 years, I've developed an intimate relationship with these ancient woodlands that sprawl across the western edge of North Carolina. My name is a Yoka walking stick. It means bringer of happiness in Cherokee, though there's bitter irony in that now. I come from a long line of Cherokee forest guardians, my ancestors having walked these lands for centuries before they were designated federal property with arbitrary boundaries and tourist trails. The elders in my family spoke of these woods with equal measures of reverence and caution. The forest remembers, my grandfather would say, his weathered hands tracing the bark of 1,000-year-old hemlocks. It watches and it keeps what belongs to it. As a child, I dismissed these as the superstitious mutterings of an old man. Now I'm not so certain. It began in early October, when the forest transitions from summer's vibrant greens to autumn's fiery palette. Reports of strange sounds echoed through dispatch. Unidentifiable howls that didn't match any known wildlife, rhythmic knocking that seemed to follow hikers, and shadowy movements glimpsed between trees at dusk. Standard procedure dictated we attribute such occurrences to known animals, bears, coyotes, even the occasional cougar, or to the overactive imaginations of inexperienced hikers. But when experienced backpackers began reporting the same phenomena, I grew concerned. Carl Whitaker, who'd been hiking these mountains for 30 years, came into the station visibly shaken one Tuesday morning. "Something followed me for 3 miles yesterday," he said, voice barely above a whisper. It stayed just out of sight, but it was big, real big, and it smelled like death and wet fur. I filed his report and assured him we'd increase patrols in the area. Yet something about his story, the tremor in his voice, the haunted look in his eyes, unsettled me deeply. That night I dreamed of my grandfather. He stood at the edge of a clearing I recognized from the eastern portion of the forest, a place locals called Whispering Ridge. In the dream, he pointed into the darkness beyond the trees and spoke in Cherokee, words I hadn't heard since childhood. "Salagi yonega tsunzdi igohida," the white giant has awakened. I woke drenched in sweat, the phrase echoing in my mind. My grandmother had occasionally mentioned stories of a creature the Cherokee called Nunyunui, a being that walked upright like a man but was covered in hair, with enormous strength and an appetite for human flesh. I'd always classified these tales alongside other tribal legends, important cultural heritage but not literal truth. The following day, another report came in. A family of 4 had failed to return from a day hike on the Black Rock Trail. Initial search efforts found their vehicle still parked at the trailhead, but no sign of the hikers themselves. As senior ranger, I assembled a search team for First Light the next morning. That evening, I called my cousin Joseph, who had followed our grandfather's path as a tribal storyteller and keeper of traditions. "The dreams have started, haven't they?" he asked before I could even explain why I was calling. "How did you know?" "There have been signs.
Animals behaving strangely.
The forest growing quiet in places it shouldn't, and the elders, they've been dreaming too. Joseph, I need to know. The stories about Nunyunui, how much truth is there to them?" The long pause that followed told me more than his eventual answer. "Our people didn't survive thousands of years by inventing threats, cousin. The stories warned of real dangers. But a giant, hairy man creature? Call it what you want," he interrupted. "Sasquatch, Bigfoot, Nunyunui. The name doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists and it's territorial, and if it's been disturbed, those hikers are in grave danger. I wanted to dismiss his warnings as superstition, but the dream weighed heavily on me. So did the responsibility of 4 missing people. What should I do if I encounter it? I asked finally. You remember the old songs? The protection chants, some of them, use them. And remember, it's not just a beast. It understands. It remembers slights and honors respect. Bring an offering. Tobacco, cornmeal. Leave it at the threshold of its territory. I thanked him, ending the call with more questions than answers. That night I packed my standard search gear, first aid kit, GPS, radio, flares, extra water, protein bars. But I also added a small pouch of tobacco and cornmeal, feeling slightly foolish as I did so. As I finished preparations, my radio crackled. It was Dawson, the night patrol ranger. Ayoka, you need to see this. Black Rock Trailhead. Now. 20 minutes later, I stood beside Dawson's truck, staring at what remained of the missing family's campsite, which search teams had somehow missed earlier. Their tent was shredded, cooking equipment scattered across a 30-foot radius. But most disturbing were the tracks. Enormous bare footprints measuring nearly 18 inches in length pressed deep into the soft earth. What the hell made these? Dawson whispered, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as it traced the outline of one massive print. I thought of my grandfather's words in the dream, of Joseph's warnings, of generations of Cherokee stories that suddenly seemed far less mythical. Something that shouldn't be here, I replied quietly. Something that's been here longer than us. Above us, the forest canopy rustled despite the still night air, and from somewhere deep within the darkness came a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite human speech, that raised the hair on my arms and sent a primal shiver down my spine. The search for the missing family had just become something else entirely. Dawn broke with an unnatural stillness over the forest. No birdsong greeted the first light, no rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. Just silence, heavy and expectant, as our search team gathered at the trailhead. I'd brought 5 rangers, all experienced outdoorsmen, but had told them nothing about my suspicions or the strange footprints Dawson and I had found. Official protocol doesn't include provisions for tracking mythological creatures. Instead, I briefed them on a standard search pattern for the missing Keller family. Parents Mark and Jenny, and their children Emma and Tyler, ages 14 and 10. We'll split into 3 teams, I instructed. Davis and Rodriguez take the North Fork, Henderson and Patel the South. Dawson and I will follow the main trail where the family was last seen. Radio check every 30 minutes. If you find anything at all, call it in immediately. Don't investigate alone. The teams dispersed, and Dawson and I began our ascent up the main Black Rock Trail. The path climbed steadily through ancient hardwoods, their leaves a kaleidoscope of autumn colors that would normally bring a sense of peace. Today they only seemed to conceal whatever watched from the shadows. You know something you're not telling us, Dawson said after we'd hiked in silence for nearly an hour. I hesitated. Dawson was Lakota, not Cherokee, but I knew he respected the old ways more than most. My grandfather used to tell stories about these woods, I finally replied. About things that lived here before us. Spirits? He asked. Maybe, or maybe something else. Something physical, but not entirely animal. Dawson nodded slowly. My people have similar stories. Things that walk in 2 worlds. Not fully spirit, not fully flesh. He gestured at the forest around us. These old places remember the time before. Sometimes what they remember walks again. We continued in silence until reaching a fork not marked on official trail maps, a faint path veering eastward toward Whispering Ridge. The same location from my dream. That's odd, Dawson said, examining the ground. Heavy traffic through here recently. I knelt beside him. The narrow game trail showed signs of multiple passages, broken twigs, disturbed leaf litter, and most concerning, what appeared to be a partial footprint in a patch of mud. Human-shaped but far too large. The Kellers wouldn't have gone this way, I said. It's not on any tourist map. Unless they were forced, Dawson replied quietly. The implication hung between us for a moment before I made a decision. Let's follow it. But stay alert. The unmarked path led deeper into increasingly dense forest. Old-growth trees towered overhead, their massive trunks creating natural columns in a primeval cathedral. The ground grew damp, the air thick with the scent of decomposing vegetation and something else, a musky, animal odor that seemed to cling to the back of my throat. After another mile, we emerged into a small clearing. I recognized it immediately from my dream, Whispering Ridge. A rock outcropping formed a natural shelf overlooking the valley below, with the mountains rising in the distance. Under other circumstances, it would be breathtaking. Today, it felt like stepping into a predator's lair. Dawson pointed silently to the ground at the clearing's edge. There, half hidden in tall grass, lay a child's backpack, bright blue with cartoon dinosaurs. Tyler Keller's eye approached cautiously, crouching to examine it. The pack was intact but stained with dirt and what looked disturbingly like dried blood. Inside, I found a water bottle, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small digital camera. "Look at this," I said, turning on the camera and accessing its memory. The most recent photos showed standard vacation snapshots. The family at the trailhead, Emma posing beside a waterfall, Tyler examining a colorful fungus. But the final images sent ice through my veins. They were blurry, clearly taken in haste. A massive dark shape moving between distant trees, then closer. A glimpse of what might be a face but not human. Too broad, too flat, with eyes reflecting the camera flash like those of a nocturnal animal. The very last photo was the most disturbing, taken from ground level, showing enormous feet approaching the camera. The image was tilted as if the photographer, presumably Tyler, had fallen while taking it. "Jesus," Dawson whispered, looking over my shoulder. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, a branch snapped in the forest behind us. We both turned sharply, hands moving instinctively to our sidearms. Nothing visible moved among the trees, but the sense of being watched intensified. I reached slowly into my pack and removed the small pouch of offerings Joseph had suggested, tobacco and cornmeal. "What are you doing?" Dawson asked. "Showing respect," I replied, placing the pouch on a flat stone at the edge of the clearing. I whispered a few words in Cherokee, a half-remembered protection chant from my childhood. As the last syllables left my lips, an answering sound emerged from the forest depths, a low, rumbling vocalization, unlike anything produced by known wildlife. It rose and fell in a pattern too regular to be random, almost like speech. The radio at my hip crackled suddenly, making us both jump. "Ayoka, this is Henderson. We found something. Over." I raised the radio. "Go ahead, Henderson. We've located what appears to be a structure of some kind, about 2 miles south of the main trail. Large branches woven together, forming a sort of dome. There's evidence someone's been inside. Recently. Any sign of the Kellers?" A pause. "Negative. But there's clothing torn and other items." His voice dropped. "I think you should see this yourself. Send coordinates. We're on our way." As we prepared to leave the clearing, another sound cut through the forest, distant but unmistakable. A human scream, high and terrified, abruptly silenced. Dawson and I locked eyes. "That came from the south," he said, "where Henderson and Patel are." We broke into a run, following our GPS toward Henderson's coordinates. As we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being allowed to leave the clearing, that whatever had made that strange vocalization was now watching our departure, perhaps even following. The forest blurred around us as we ran, the terrain growing steeper and more difficult. Twice I nearly fell on slick patches of decaying leaves. The third time, Dawson caught my arm, steadying me. He opened his mouth to speak, then froze, eyes fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly. There, not 20 yards away, stood what I can only describe as a nightmare given flesh. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark matted hair. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms too long for its frame, ending in hands with fingers that seemed almost prehensile. But it was the face that haunts me still, a blend of ape and human features with a pronounced brow ridge shadowing deeply set eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. For 3 heartbeats, we stared at each other, ranger and legend, man and monster, each assessing the other. Then it raised one massive hand, pointing deliberately toward the south, the direction of Henderson's discovery and the scream we'd heard. A warning? A threat? An invitation? Before I could begin to interpret the gesture, it turned with surprising grace and melted into the forest shadows, leaving only swaying branches and a lingering musky odor as evidence it had ever been there. "Did you see?" Dawson began. Yes, I cut him off. And we're going to pretend we didn't until we find the Kellers. But as we resumed our journey south, the creature's deliberate pointing gesture replayed in my mind. Whatever we were walking toward, I suspected it was exactly where this forest guardian wanted us to go, and that realization terrified me more than the creature itself. We moved through the forest with heightened awareness, every sense straining for signs of danger or pursuit. The encounter had left us both shaken. Though neither of us spoke of it directly, some experiences defy immediate verbalization, especially when they shatter one's understanding of the natural world. "How much further to Henderson's coordinates?" Dawson asked, voice hushed. I checked the GPS. "Less than half a mile. We should radio ahead." I raised the device to my lips. "Henderson, this is Ayoka. We're approaching your position." "Do you copy?" Nothing but static answered. "Henderson, Patel, respond over." More static than a brief burst of what might have been a voice. Too distorted to comprehend. "Reception's bad in these valleys," Dawson offered, though his expression betrayed the same concern I felt. 20 minutes later, we reached the coordinates Henderson had transmitted. The site was located in a small depression surrounded by ancient hemlocks, their massive trunks creating a natural barrier. And there, in the center of this protected space, stood the structure Henderson had described, though structure seemed an inadequate term for what we found. It was enormous, at least 15 feet tall and twice that in diameter. Hundreds of branches had been meticulously woven together to create a dome-shaped framework, then covered with layers of vegetation, bark, and what appeared to be animal hides. The craftsmanship was astonishing, displaying an intelligence and dexterity I'd never associated with any woodland creature. "My God," Dawson whispered. "It's like a nest. Or a house." "Henderson," I called, scanning the area. "Patel." No response came from our colleagues, but the ground told a story. Multiple sets of footprints converged on the structure, the standard-issue boots of our fellow rangers and smaller prints that likely belonged to the Keller family. But there were other impressions too, the now familiar massive, bare footprints we'd seen earlier and something else that made my blood run cold. Drag marks, leading from where we stood to the structure's entrance. "They went inside," I said, unholstering my sidearm. "All of them." Dawson followed suit. "Voluntarily?" I indicated the drag marks. "Not all of them. The entrance was low, requiring us to crouch as we entered. The interior was surprisingly spacious and illuminated by filtered light that penetrated the woven ceiling. The air inside was thick with that same musky odor we'd encountered earlier, now so strong it was almost suffocating. What we found inside defied easy explanation. The space was divided into rough sections suggesting purpose and organization. One area contained what appeared to be bedding, piles of leaves and grass covered with animal pelts. Another held an assortment of objects clearly taken from humans. Backpacks, clothing, camping equipment, even toys and books, arranged with an eerie semblance of order. But most disturbing was the central area, where a depression in the earth formed a kind of pit. Around this pit lay scattered bones, mostly animal, but some disturbingly human in appearance. And beside this macabre collection, we found Henderson's radio and Patel's cap, but no sign of our colleagues. "We need to call for backup," Dawson said, his voice tight with controlled fear. I raised my radio again, but inside the structure, the static was even worse. No signal. "We'll have to go back outside." As we turned to leave, something caught my eye. A flash of color against the earthy tones of the structure's interior. There, half buried in the nest-like bedding, was a child's shoe, red and white, sized for a 10-year-old boy. "Tyler Kellers." I moved toward it, but Dawson grabbed my arm. "Listen," he hissed. From outside came the sound of movement. Heavy footfalls approaching the structure. Not one set, but several moving with purpose toward the entrance. "Back," I whispered, pulling Dawson toward the rear of the structure where shadows were deepest. We barely concealed ourselves before they entered. 3 massive figures similar to the one we'd encountered earlier, but each distinct in size and coloration. They moved with a fluid grace that belied their enormous bulk, communicating through a series of low vocalizations and hand gestures that suggested a complex language too. Of them carried what at first appeared to be bundles of cloth but revealed themselves to be people. Henderson and Patel, both unconscious but seemingly unharmed. They placed our colleagues carefully on the bedding area, then retreated to the entrance where they conferred through more of those strange vocalizations. My mind raced, trying to process what I was witnessing. Not one creature, but a group. Not mindless beasts, but intelligent beings with language, social structure, and what appeared to be rituals. Everything I thought I knew about the natural world was crumbling before my eyes. The largest of the three suddenly stiffened, raising its head to sniff the air. Its gaze swept the interior, pausing at our hiding place. I tightened my grip on my weapon, knowing it would be useless against such creatures, but finding some comfort in its familiar weight. The creature took a step toward us, then hesitated as another sound came from outside, a high, rhythmic call that seemed to hold meaning for them. All three turned and lumbered out of the structure with surprising speed. "Now," I whispered to Dawson, "check on Henderson and Patel while I watch the entrance." Dawson moved quickly to our colleagues while I kept my weapon trained on the opening. Outside, the vocalizations continued, now joined by others in what sounded like an urgent exchange. "They're alive," Dawson reported. "Pulse strong, breathing normal. Looks like they were knocked unconscious, but I don't see any serious injuries." "Can you wake them?" He tried, shaking Henderson gently, then more vigorously, with no response. "They're out cold. Some kind of sedative, maybe." A new sound drew my attention. A child's voice, distant but distinct. "Mom? Dad?" "Tyler Keller." "They have the family," I said. "They're alive." The vocalizations outside intensified, then abruptly ceased. In the silence that followed, I made a decision. We can't carry Henderson and Patel out of here by ourselves, and we can't leave them. One of us needs to go for help while the other stays. Dawson nodded. "I'll stay. You know these woods better, and you know the legends. You'll have a better chance of finding help and returning." I wanted to argue, but knew he was right. "Keep your radio on. I'll signal when I'm clear of the area and can get reception." As I prepared to leave, Dawson grabbed my arm. "Ayoka, what are these things? Why are they taking people?" I thought of my grandfather's stories, of the respect the old ones showed the forest and its guardians. I don't know, but I don't think they're killing for food or sport. This feels purposeful, like they're collecting us or protecting something from us. I moved toward the entrance, then paused, retrieving the small pouch of offerings I'd brought. I placed it at the threshold of the structure, murmuring the Cherokee words my grandfather had taught me. "We come in respect. We seek only what is ours." Outside, the forest had fallen silent again. No sign of the creatures remained, though their presence seemed to linger in the very air. I oriented myself toward the nearest ranger station, a difficult 5-mile journey through increasingly unfamiliar terrain, and began moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. I'd traveled less than 100 yards when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, I turned to scan my surroundings, seeing nothing but forest shadows. Then a twig snapped behind me. I whirled, weapon raised. There stood a small figure, a human child in dirt-smeared clothing. Tyler Keller, his eyes wide with terror and something else. "A warning. They're coming back," he whispered. "And they're angry." "Tyler," I said softly, holstering my weapon and crouching to the boy's level. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, eyes darting nervously to the forest behind me. "We have to go. Now, where's your family? Your sister and parents?" "They took them deeper, the big ones." His voice trembled. "I got away when they weren't looking." I reached for my radio, then stopped as Tyler's expression transformed to pure terror. He wasn't looking at me anymore, but past me, at something approaching from behind. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. The creature stood less than 30 feet away. Not one of the three we'd observed in the structure, but another, larger than the others. Its dark fur was streaked with gray around the face and shoulders, suggesting age. Unlike the others, this one carried a crude staff of some kind, a thick branch worn smooth by what must have been years of handling. For a long moment we stared at each other, the ancient forest silent around us. Then, deliberately, it raised the staff and struck the ground 3 times. The hollow sound echoed through the trees like a signal, or a warning. "Run," I whispered to Tyler, pushing him ahead of me. Go! We broke into a sprint, crashing through underbrush with no attempt at stealth, desperation fueling our flight. Behind us came sounds of pursuit, heavy footfalls and the cracking of branches as something massive moved through the forest with frightening speed. Tyler ran with the boundless energy of youth and terror, but I knew he couldn't maintain such pace for long. We needed a plan beyond blind flight. This way, I gasped, grabbing his arm and veering sharply left toward a rocky outcropping I'd spotted through the trees. If we could reach higher ground, perhaps we could find a defensible position or at least get radio reception to call for help. The terrain grew steeper, the forest thinning as we climbed. Tyler stumbled once, twice, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I pulled him along, acutely aware of the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Almost there, I encouraged. Though in truth I had no idea what awaited us at the top of the ridge. We emerged onto a flat rocky area that offered a panoramic view of the forest below. In the distance I could see the main trail, and beyond it, the glint of the ranger station's metal roof. So close, yet impossibly far given what stood between us and safety. "They're coming," Tyler whimpered, pointing to movement in the tree line below. Not one creature emerged from the forest, but 5, the elder with the staff and 4 others, moving with purpose toward our position. They spread out, clearly intending to cut off any escape route back down the slope. I pulled out my radio, desperate now. "This is Ranger Ahyoka Walking Stick. Emergency situation at Whispering Ridge. Multiple hostile entities. Officers down. Civilian child with me. Request immediate assistance." Through the static came a broken response. "Copy location. ETA 20 minutes." We needed to hold this position for 20 minutes against creatures that defied understanding. I turned to Tyler, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. "Help is coming. We just need to stay here and—" A roar from below interrupted me, a sound so primal and powerful it seemed to vibrate the very rock beneath our feet. The creatures were no longer approaching slowly but charging up the slope with alarming speed. I drew my sidearm, knowing it was likely useless but seeing no alternative. "Stay behind me," I told Tyler, positioning myself between him and the approaching threat. The first creature crested the ridge not 30 seconds later, its massive form silhouetted against the forest below. I fired a warning shot into the air, hoping the sound might startle or deter it. The creature paused, head tilting as if curious rather than frightened. Then it made a sound, not a roar or growl, but something that chilled me far more. A close approximation of human speech, garbled but recognizable. "Give, boy." I fired another shot, closer this time, kicking up rock fragments near its feet. "Stay back." The elder with the staff appeared next, moving with surprising agility despite its apparent age. It made a gesture to the first creature, which reluctantly retreated a few steps. The elder approached slowly, its gaze fixed not on me but on Tyler. It raised one massive hand, pointing first at the boy, then back toward the forest depths, then made a series of complex gestures that seemed intended to communicate something vital. "What does it want?" Tyler whispered, clutching my jacket. Before I could answer, movement from the corner of my eye drew my attention. 2 more creatures had circled around, approaching from our flank. They were closing in carefully, using the rocky terrain for cover. "They're trying to surround us," I said, backing toward the edge of the outcropping opposite the creature's approach. Behind us lay a steep drop, not immediately fatal but certainly dangerous. A last resort. The elder creature seemed to recognize our dwindling options. It stopped advancing and lowered itself to a crouching position, then did something extraordinary. It placed its staff on the ground and pushed it toward us. A gesture of peace, or some other meaning I couldn't fathom. In that moment of uncertainty, Tyler gasped, "My sister's necklace!" I glanced down. Around the staff was wrapped a thin silver chain with a small pendant, a gift Emma Keller had received for her 14th birthday, according to the missing persons report. "They have her," Tyler said. "They want to trade." The realization struck me with horrifying clarity. These creatures weren't hunting us, they were negotiating. They had the rest of the Keller family and wanted Tyler returned to them. But why? What purpose could a family of tourists serve to these forest entities? The elder creature made another series of gestures, then spoke or attempted to speak in broken approximations of English. Family. Together. Safe. I kept my weapon raised, mind racing. Where are they? The rest of his family? In response, the creature pointed toward the forest depths, then back at Tyler, then made a sweeping motion that encompassed all of us, I think. I said slowly. It's saying your family is safe and it wants to take you to them. I'm not going with them. Tyler cried, shrinking further behind me. The elder creature made a sound that might have been frustration, then tried again. Danger. Coming. Protect. Protect from what? I demanded, though I knew it couldn't possibly understand such a complex question. As if in answer, a new sound cut through the standoff. The distinctive whump, whump, whump of approaching helicopter rotors. The rescue team arriving sooner than expected. The effect on the creatures was immediate and dramatic. They looked skyward with evident alarm, vocalizing urgently to each other. The elder made one last desperate gesture toward Tyler. Then, to my astonishment, placed both massive hands on the ground in what could only be described as a posture of supplication. It was begging. The helicopter appeared over the ridge, hovering above us, its spotlight cutting through the gathering dusk to illuminate our position. Through the open door, I could see armed rangers preparing to descend. The creatures retreated from the light, moving back toward the forest edge. The elder was the last to go, its gaze never leaving Tyler as it slowly backed away. As rescue ropes dropped from the helicopter, I made a split-second decision that would haunt me for years to come. I lowered my weapon. Wait, I called to the rescue team, then turned to Tyler. They're afraid of the helicopter. They're retreating, but I don't think they meant to harm us. They took my family, he said, tears streaming down his dirt-stained face. Yes, and I think they're trying to tell us why. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in my mind since this began. Tyler, did anything strange happen before your family disappeared? Did anyone do anything that might have, I don't know, disturbed something in the forest? His expression changed, guilt flashing across his features. Dad wanted to explore off-trail. He said we'd find better photo opportunities. We found this weird circle of stones with carvings. Emma said it looked like an altar or something. Dad took one of the stones as a souvenir. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. My grandfather's warnings about respect, about the forest remembering. The creatures weren't predators, they were guardians of something ancient and sacred. The helicopter landed on the ridge, rangers spilling out with weapons drawn. The rescue had arrived, but as Tyler was whisked to safety, and I gave my preliminary report, carefully edited to exclude the more fantastical elements, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had fundamentally misunderstood the situation. Whatever was coming, the danger the elder creature had tried to warn about was still out there, and we had just rejected the only beings who seemed to understand it. As twilight deepened over the forest, I watched the creatures retreat into the shadows, knowing with grim certainty that this encounter was far from over. 3 days after the rescue, I sat in the station office completing paperwork that could never capture the truth of what had occurred. The official report read like fiction, even with the supernatural elements removed. Missing family located, 2 rangers recovering from unexplained unconsciousness, evidence of unidentified predators in the area. The forest had been temporarily closed to visitors pending an environmental assessment. Henderson and Patel had regained consciousness in the hospital, with no memory of what had happened after finding the structure. Tyler Keller was physically unharmed but deeply traumatized, and the rest of the Keller family remained missing. Despite the largest search operation in the park's history, I hadn't told anyone the full story, not about the creature's attempted communication, nor about Tyler's revelation regarding the stone circle. Some truths are too strange to be believed without witnessing them firsthand. But I had made one call, to my cousin Joseph. You were right, I told him, voice low even in the privacy of my office. The stories were true. His response was measured, as if he'd been expecting this conversation for years. Did you see it then? Nunyunubi. Them, there's more than one. A whole group. A long silence followed. Then, what did they want? I think they were protecting something. Sacred ground, maybe. The missing family disturbed it, took something they shouldn't have. And the family, still missing, Except the boy. He got away, or was allowed to escape to lead us to them. I'm not sure. Joseph sighed heavily. The old ones spoke of this. When disrespect is shown to sacred places, the guardians take action. Not out of malice, but necessity. What kind of necessity justifies taking people? I don't know. But our ancestors believed some boundaries weren't meant to be crossed. Some knowledge wasn't meant for all. The guardians enforced those boundaries. I thought of the elder creature's desperate attempts to communicate, its final posture of supplication. They tried to tell me something. About danger coming. I think they wanted our help or to help us. Then you should listen, Joseph said simply. The old ones didn't survive by ignoring warnings. That conversation led me here to this moment of decision. The search teams had been called off. The official investigation winding down with the Keller family now presumed dead. But I knew they were out there, somewhere in the forest depths, held by creatures that defied scientific understanding for purposes I could only guess at. I packed my gear methodically. Supplies for 3 days, extra ammunition, first aid kit. This wasn't an authorized operation. I'd taken personal leave, told no one of my plans. What I was attempting might cost me my job, possibly my life. But the alternative, doing nothing, allowing those people to remain missing when I alone might be able to find them, was unthinkable. As I prepared to leave, my phone buzzed with a text from Joseph. Remember the offering. And the words. I added tobacco and cornmeal to my pack along with something else, the stone Tyler had described, which I'd found among the family's recovered belongings. If the creatures wanted it returned to its sacred place, perhaps it could serve as a peace offering or bargaining chip. The forest welcomed me with familiar sounds as I set out shortly before dusk, the time when, according to legend, the veil between worlds grew thinnest. I headed directly for the structure we'd discovered, bypassing regular trails and ranger checkpoints. The dome-like construction stood as we'd left it, but the area around it had changed. Fresh markings had been carved into nearby trees, symbols I recognized from ancient Cherokee petroglyphs, warnings about sacred boundaries and cosmic balance. I approached the entrance and knelt, placing the tobacco and cornmeal at the threshold. I come with respect, I said aloud in Cherokee, the words feeling both foreign and familiar on my tongue. I seek understanding. No response came from within the structure. I waited, minutes stretching into an hour as darkness fell completely. Finally, I made a decision. I would enter. The interior was empty of both creatures and any sign of the Keller family. But something new had been added. A crude map scratched into the earthen floor, showing familiar landmarks. The ridge where we'd made our stand. The structure itself and another location marked with concentric circles. An invitation? Or a warning to stay away? I studied it carefully, memorizing the route before continuing my journey. The map led deeper into the forest's unexplored regions, toward an area marked on official maps as unstable terrain, and generally avoided by rangers and hikers alike. The night grew darker, clouds obscuring the moon and stars. I continued by flashlight, knowing it made me visible but seeing no alternative. The path grew increasingly difficult, steep slopes, dense underbrush, fallen trees creating natural barriers. Not random obstacles, I realized, but deliberate ones, designed to discourage casual exploration. After 3 hours of grueling hiking, I reached what appeared to be my destination, a perfectly circular clearing surrounded by ancient trees growing in an unnaturally perfect ring. At its center stood a stone formation, not quite a building, not quite an altar, but something that radiated antiquity and purpose. I approached cautiously, flashlight beam playing over stone surfaces covered in carvings similar to those I'd seen near the structure. Some I recognized from Cherokee tradition. Others were entirely unfamiliar, spiraling patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed peripherally. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. My flashlight flickered, then dimmed despite fresh batteries. The forest had fallen completely silent, not even insect sounds penetrating this sacred space. I placed the stolen stone on the altar-like central formation, then stepped back, waiting. They emerged from the forest as silently as shadows. 7 of the creatures, including the elder with the staff. They arranged themselves in a semicircle, watching me with those 2 intelligent eyes. I've brought back what was taken, I said clearly, indicating the stone. I want to help. Where is the Keller family? The elder approached, examining the returned stone, then made a sound that might have been approval. It turned to me and attempted speech again. Too late. What do you mean, too late? Are they dead? It shook its massive head, then pointed to the stone formation. Waking, coming through. A chill ran down my spine. What's coming through? Instead of answering, the elder gestured for me to approach the stone formation. When I hesitated, it made an impatient sound and repeated the gesture more emphatically. I stepped forward slowly, every instinct screaming caution. As I neared the central stones, I noticed something I'd missed before, a narrow opening between them, revealing a darkness deeper than the night around us. The elder pointed to this opening, then to my flashlight, clearly wanting me to illuminate whatever lay within. I directed my beam into the darkness. At first I saw nothing but stone. Then movement caught my eye, something shifting within that impossible space, something that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I leaned closer, squinting to make out details. What happened next defies easy explanation. The darkness moved, not like a physical object, but like a tear in reality itself. It expanded outward, reaching like tendrils toward the flashlight beam. My light didn't penetrate it. Rather, the darkness seemed to consume the light, growing stronger with each moment of exposure. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight in shock. The elder creature caught my arm with surprising gentleness, steadying me, then pointed again to the opening with evident urgency. Through this rift in reality, for I had no other words to describe it, came sounds, whispers in languages I'd never heard, carrying emotions rather than meaning. Fear, hunger, ancient rage. Understanding crashed over me like a physical wave. These creatures, these guardians, weren't keeping people out of the forest. They were keeping something else in. The stone circle was a door, or perhaps a prison, and the Kellers had unknowingly begun to unlock it by removing one of its components. The family, I managed to ask. Are they? The elder made a gesture I interpreted as reassurance, then pointed to the forest behind us. As if on cue, 4 figures emerged from the trees, Mark, Jenny, and Emma Keller, accompanied by another of the creatures. They appeared physically unharmed but moved with the dreamlike quality of sleepwalkers. What did you do to them? I demanded. The elder creature touched its own head, then gestured to the rift. Protect. From seeing, from knowing, I understood with horrifying clarity. Whatever lay beyond that rift was not meant for human minds to comprehend. The creatures had somehow shielded the Kellers from that knowledge, keeping them in a state of protective unconsciousness. But why show me? Why risk my sanity with this revelation? As if reading my thoughts, the elder approached and, with unexpected gentleness, placed one massive hand on my shoulder. With the other, it indicated first itself, then me, then the stone circle, a gesture of shared responsibility. Guardians, it said, the word surprisingly clear. Need help. The request stunned me. These ancient beings, powerful enough to move through our world like ghosts, were asking for human assistance? But as I looked again at the rift, at the darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent intent, I began to understand. Whatever balance had existed was shifting. The boundaries between worlds were thinning. And perhaps in this new reality, the old guardians were no longer enough. I thought of my grandfather's words, "The forest remembers." Not just the trees and earth, but these beings who had watched over it since time immemorial. They remembered a covenant with my ancestors, a shared stewardship of boundaries that should not be crossed. What do you need me to do? I asked. The elder indicated the Keller family, then the path back toward civilization. First, we would return these innocents to safety. Then I understood I would return to learn what role I was to play in this ancient vigil. As we began our journey back, the elder creature walked beside me, its presence no longer terrifying but somehow comforting. We moved through the forest, ranger and legend, man and monster, united by something older and more important than the differences between us. Behind us, carefully resealed but still vulnerable, the boundary between worlds waited, and beyond it something ancient stirred, testing its prison walls, patient in its hunger. The forest remembered. Now so would I.